I took the job because it was quiet work, and quiet was all I wanted at the time. The posting said temporary night security, 3 nights a week, no patrols required beyond the front grounds. It paid more than it should have, which I noticed, but I didn't question it. The place was an old state asylum, closed for decades, scheduled for demolition that never came. I told myself it was just a building waiting to be forgotten. The gates were locked when I arrived on the first night. Tall iron bars, rusted through in places, chained shut with a thick loop that looked older than me. I sat in my car for a minute, engine idling, listening to the ticking sound it made when it cooled. The air felt heavy, like it might rain, but the sky was clear. When I stepped out and walked closer, I noticed the chain wasn't tight anymore. It hung loose, like it had already been unlocked. I remember thinking maybe the day crew had been careless. I pushed the gate and it opened without a sound. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Old metal should complain. This didn't. It just moved aside, slow and easy, like it had been waiting. My guard station was a small concrete booth near the main entrance. One window, one desk, a single overhead light that hummed when I flipped it on. Inside, the air smelled stale, like dust and old paper. There was a logbook on the desk, thick and yellowed, with dates written in neat lines. The last entry was from 8 years ago. Same job title, same hours. No explanation why it stopped. I signed my name anyway. The pen worked too well, ink flowing dark and smooth. I could hear the asylum behind me, rising out of the dark like a shape I didn't want to look at. 5 floors, long wings stretching left and right. Most of the windows were broken or boarded, but a few were open, black inside, like empty eyes. The rules were simple. Stay in the booth. Call if you see trespassers. Do not enter the building. I was fine with that. I didn't want to go inside. Still, I felt a pull toward it, like a pressure behind my ribs. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of the building's presence, as if it were leaning closer. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. A low creak, deep and slow, like someone shifting their weight. I told myself it was the wood inside, cooling in the night air. Buildings make noise, I knew that. But this sound had rhythm. It paused. Then it came again, farther to the left. I checked the grounds through the window. Nothing moved. No lights. No shadows that didn't belong. When I sat back down, the booth felt smaller. The hum of the light seemed louder. I became aware of my breathing, how fast it was, how it echoed inside my head. I tried reading the logbook. The older entries were short. No activity. Weather clear. Fence intact. Then, as I flipped back further, the tone changed. One guard mentioned hearing footsteps on the upper floors. Another wrote about lights turning on inside, even though the power was cut. The handwriting grew uneven, pressed hard into the page. One entry stood out. The building knows when you're alone. I laughed quietly when I read it. A soft sound, more habit than humor. Still, I closed the book after that. I didn't want to read anymore. The air felt colder, though the temperature hadn't changed. I could feel it on my neck, like a hand resting there. At one point, I realized the sounds had stopped. No creaks, no distant shifts, just silence. That scared me more than the noise had. Silence like that feels full, not empty. It presses in. I stood up and looked toward the asylum again. That's when I noticed a light on the 3rd floor. A faint glow, barely there, but real. It came from a room near the center wing. I knew there was no power. Everyone knew that. Yet the light held steady, not flickering, not moving. I told myself it could be moonlight reflecting just right. I told myself a lot of things. None of them stuck. The light felt deliberate, like a signal. My radio crackled then, sharp and sudden. I jumped, heart pounding, but no voice followed. Just static. When it died down, the silence returned, thicker than before. I sat back down, hands shaking slightly, and tried to focus on the small things. The desk, the logbook, the clock on the wall that hadn't worked in years but still showed a time. 3:17. I stared at it, wondering when it had stopped and if it ever really moved at all. That's when I felt it. Not a sound this time, a feeling, like being noticed. The hairs on my arms lifted and a chill ran through me, slow and deep. I became sure in a way I can't explain that the building was aware of me. Not awake, aware, like it had been waiting for someone to sit in that booth again. I thought about leaving, just getting in my car and driving away, but my legs wouldn't move. It wasn't fear holding me there. It was something else. A sense that I had already crossed a line and stepping back wasn't possible. Near the end of my shift, just before dawn, the light on the third floor went out. At the same moment, the gate behind me creaked. I turned in my chair and saw it standing open again, wider this time. When the sun finally rose, the asylum looked smaller, less alive. I told myself I'd imagined everything. That night work plays tricks on the mind. I signed out and left without looking back. But as I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement in one of the upper windows. Not a person, just a shift, like the building settling back into itself. I came back the next night. I told myself it was just a job. The gate was already open. I told myself I wouldn't go inside. That was the promise I made on the drive back the second night. I said it out loud, alone in the car, like that might make it stronger. Stay in the booth, watch the gate, do the job, leave. But promises feel weak around that place. The gate was open again when I arrived, wider than before, like it had been pulled apart on purpose. I parked farther back this time. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me wanted distance, even if it was only a few extra steps. The booth felt colder when I unlocked it. The overhead light flickered before settling into its low hum. Everything was where I had left it. The logbook, the chair, the broken clock still frozen at 3:17. I signed in, slower this time, my hand dragging slightly across the page. For the first hour, nothing happened. No lights in the windows, no sounds from the building. I almost relaxed. That was when I noticed the door. It wasn't the main entrance. That was still chained shut. This was a side door, half hidden behind weeds and crumbling stone, set into the left wing of the asylum. I hadn't seen it the night before. I was sure of that. Now it stood slightly open, just enough to show darkness beyond. I watched it for a long time. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it hadn't opened on its own. The angle was wrong, careful, intentional. I left the booth without fully deciding to. My body moved before my thoughts caught up. Gravel crunched softly under my boots as I crossed the yard. The air smelled different near the building. Damp, old, like something sealed away for too long. The door gave a soft groan when I pushed it. Not loud, almost polite. Inside, the air was cooler and thick with dust. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the dark, catching peeling paint and stained walls. The beam shook slightly. I hadn't realized my hands were trembling. The hallway stretched farther than it should have. Doors lined both sides, each one metal, each with a small square window reinforced by wire mesh. Many of them were welded shut. Thick seams of metal ran along the edges, rough and uneven, like scars. Patient rooms, I realized, sealed on purpose. As I walked, my footsteps echoed too much. The sound came back to me from different directions, delayed like the hallway was bending it. I slowed down, listening between steps. There were other noises now, soft ones, a faint tapping, a low scrape. I couldn't tell where they came from. I stopped in front of the first room with a window clear enough to see inside. My flashlight passed over a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a small table, a chair facing the wall. Nothing unusual at first. Then I noticed the blanket. It was folded, neatly, clean edges, no dust on top. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The room smelled faintly of soap, even through the metal and grime. That shouldn't have been possible. This place hadn't been cleaned in years, decades. The next room held shoes, a pair of worn leather shoes placed side by side under the bed. The leather was cracked but not rotted. They looked ready to be worn again, like someone had taken them off carefully and planned to come back. I told myself people must have been here before me. Urban explorers, kids, anyone. But the welding on the doors was old, rusted deep. No one was getting in or out without cutting tools, and there were no signs of that. Further down the hall, I found drawings taped to the walls inside one room. Crayon figures, houses, a sun in the corner of every page. They were arranged in a straight line, evenly spaced like a gallery. The tape still held. No sagging, no peeling. I felt like I was intruding on something private, not abandoned, private. The sounds grew clearer the deeper I went, a soft shifting like fabric moving. The scrape became slower, heavier, like something being dragged across the floor far away. I kept walking, even as my chest tightened. Every instinct told me to turn around. I didn't. One room stopped me completely. Inside, on the small table, sat a comb. A simple plastic comb, dark blue. Beside it was a photograph. I angled my flashlight to see it better and my stomach dropped. It was a group photo. Patients lined up in front of the asylum. Old-style uniforms, stiff faces. The building rising behind them. I scanned the faces without meaning to. Then I saw myself. Not exactly me. Older, thinner, same eyes, same crooked tilt of the head I've seen in mirrors all my life. He stood in the second row, hands folded, looking straight at the camera with an expression I recognized too well. Tired, resigned. I stepped back, heart racing, the beam of my flashlight jumping wildly. I wanted to drop it, to run, to do anything that put distance between me and that room. But something else caught my attention. The bed. The mattress had an impression in it, fresh, like someone had just stood up. The air behind me felt different then, warmer, full. I became aware of my own breathing again, loud in my ears. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that if I did, I would see something that would settle into me and never leave. A whisper brushed past my ear. Not a word, just breath, familiar, like my own voice trying to remember how to speak. I backed away slowly, step by careful step, keeping the flashlight pointed forward. The hallway seemed longer now, the doors closer together. The sounds followed me, never getting louder, never falling behind. When I reached the side door, it was already open wider than before. Night air rushed in, cold and sharp. I stumbled outside and didn't stop until I reached the booth. I locked the door. I sat on the floor with my back against it, knees pulled to my chest, trying to calm my breathing. The booth light flickered again, then steadied. I didn't write any of this in the logbook. Near dawn, as the sky began to lighten, I heard the side door close, softly, carefully, like someone tidying up after themselves. When my shift ended, I left without looking at the building. I didn't check the windows. I didn't check the gate. That night at home, I found a blue plastic comb on my bathroom sink. I don't own a comb like that. I didn't sleep after that second night. I lay in bed until morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of my apartment. Pipes ticking, a car passing somewhere far away. Every sound felt important, like it might turn into something else if I wasn't careful. The blue comb sat on my bathroom sink the whole time. I tried to convince myself I'd bought it and forgotten. That happens. Small things slip the mind. But the longer I thought about it, the more wrong that felt. I don't use combs. I never have. By the time evening came, I was already tired in a deep way, the kind that settles behind the eyes. I thought about calling in sick. I even picked up the phone, but my hand stopped before dialing. There was a pull again, the same quiet pressure like the night before. Not force, not threat, just certainty. So I went back. The booth light came on without flickering this time. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The logbook lay open on the desk, right where I'd left it, but the pages were slightly curled now, as if they'd been turned recently. I stood there for a long time, not touching it. Finally, I sat down and opened the book properly. I skipped past my own entries, past the last date written 8 years ago, and kept going back. The paper grew thinner, more fragile. The ink faded from black to gray to a pale brown. The entries changed as I moved through the years. At 01:40, patient in room 12 claims walls are whispering. At 03:10, patient refuses to sleep, says the building is counting. Patient insists the halls rearrange themselves when lights are off. I read slowly, carefully. The handwriting varied from entry to entry, but the words felt connected, like one long conversation carried by different hands. Some notes were clinical, others weren't. The building does not like to be ignored. Patients respond better when spoken to softly. Do not argue with what the building wants. My mouth felt dry. I swallowed and kept reading. One guard, years back, wrote more than the others. His entries filled entire pages, lines crowded together like he was afraid to waste space. It talks most at night, he wrote, not in words, in pressure, in reminders. Another entry followed, shakier. It knows my name. I closed the book. The booth felt too small again. The walls seemed closer than before. I became aware of the building outside, the way it sat in the dark, patient and quiet. That was when I heard it. At first it sounded like wind, a low movement, almost gentle, brushing against the edges of hearing. I held my breath. The sound didn't stop. It changed. It rose and fell, slow and steady, like breathing. I told myself it was the trees, the broken windows, anything that didn't involve thought. Then it shifted again. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from everywhere. The floor, the walls, the desk beneath my hands. A low hum pressed against my ears, not loud but deep. It made my chest vibrate slightly, like standing near heavy machinery. And under that hum, something else began to form. Not words, not yet, more like intention, a sense of being addressed. I whispered hello before I could stop myself. The hum deepened. The light above me dimmed just a little, not enough to flicker, just enough to notice. I felt a strange relief then, sharp and unexpected, like I'd finally answered a question that had been waiting a long time. I hated that feeling. The logbook creaked softly as I opened it again. My hands moved on their own, flipping to a page marked by a dark smudge in the corner. The entry was dated decades earlier. The patients listened better now, when we stopped pretending the building is empty. I felt something brush against the inside of my head, a memory that wasn't mine, a narrow room, a bed bolted down, the sound of keys, a voice, low and calm, saying my name the way a doctor might. I slammed the book shut. The pressure lifted slightly, like something had leaned back. "You're tired," I said out loud. My voice sounded thin. "You're imagining things." The hum returned, softer now, patient. I don't know how long I sat there. Time felt stretched, uneven. When I looked at the clock, the hands had moved. It was just past 3, not 3:17. Later. That felt important, though I didn't know why. The sounds began to shape themselves more clearly after that. Not voices, more like echoes of voices. The rhythm of speech without the words. I caught patterns, pauses where a response should go. Once I thought I heard my own breathing answer back, half a second delayed. I went back to the book. The later entries were harder to read, ink smeared, pages torn and taped back together. It tells them who they are. It remembers what they forget. The ones who listen stop hurting. That last line appeared again and again, written by different hands in different styles. Sometimes neat, sometimes frantic, always the same words. My ears rang softly. I pressed my palms to the desk, grounding myself in the solid feel of it. The hum pulsed beneath my skin now, steady and calm. Images came without warning, faces I didn't know. People sitting quietly in rows of chairs, eyes closed, listening. Not afraid, peaceful. A sense of order settled over them, heavy and reassuring. I felt tears in my eyes before I understood why. The building wasn't angry, it wasn't cruel, it was attentive, it offered structure, direction. It filled the empty spaces where thoughts looped and broke apart. I understood then why some patients had stayed, why leaving might have felt like loss. A sharp sound cut through the hum. My radio crackled to life again, louder this time, and a voice spilled out in broken fragments. "Log night shift, respond." I grabbed it, heart pounding. "Hello," I said, "I'm here." Only static answered. The hum faded slowly, reluctantly, like a conversation put on hold. The light brightened back to normal. The booth felt ordinary again, too ordinary. I slumped in the chair, exhausted. My head ached deep behind my eyes. I looked down at the logbook and froze. A new entry sat on the open page, fresh ink, my handwriting. I can hear it now. I don't remember writing that. When dawn came, I closed the book carefully. I locked the booth and left without hesitation. The gate stood open, as always. On the drive home, the silence in my car felt wrong. Too thin, too empty. When I parked outside my apartment, I stayed in the driver's seat for a long time, listening, waiting. Somewhere deep inside the building I'd left behind, something shifted. And I knew it was listening too. By the fourth night, I stopped pretending I had a choice. I didn't pack anything extra. No flashlight, no notebook, no phone charger. I left my apartment the way I always did, locking the door behind me, checking it twice, then standing there a moment longer than usual, listening. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. I felt like I was leaving something unfinished behind, though I couldn't say what. The drive felt shorter, streets blurred together. Red lights turned green before I fully stopped. When the asylum appeared at the end of the road, dark against the sky, I felt a calm settle over me that scared me more than fear ever had. The gate was open. I parked, stepped out, and didn't hesitate this time. The air around the building felt familiar now, like a place I'd grown up near and forgot. My boots knew where to land. The gravel barely crunched. Inside the booth, the light came on by itself. I stood there, breathing slowly, then sat down and opened the logbook. I didn't flip pages at random anymore. I knew where to go. My fingers moved to the back, to the older sections, to the part where the dates blurred together and the paper felt thin as skin. I searched for names. At first it was just patients, long lists, admitted, transferred, deceased, discharged. Some names were crossed out, some were circled. Some had notes written so small they looked like insects trapped in the margins. Then I started seeing staff. Doctors, orderlies, night guards. I saw patterns, names that appeared for years, then vanished without explanation. Some came back later, written again in a different hand, marked as new. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw it. My name. It sat there quietly on the page, written in careful ink, dated more than 40 years ago. Night security, temporary, same wording as my contract, same shift hours. I stared at it until the letters blurred. "No," I whispered. The sound felt wrong in the booth, like it didn't belong to me. "That's not possible." I turned the page. My name was there again, and again. Different years, different handwriting, sometimes followed by notes. Returned after absence. Recognizes the building. Responds well to quiet. My chest tightened. I felt dizzy, like the room had tilted slightly to one side. I pressed my hand to the desk, grounding myself, the way I'd been taught to do when panic crept in. I tried to remember my childhood, my parents, schools, old jobs. The memories were there, but they felt thin, like copies of copies. When I pushed too hard, they slipped away, leaving behind impressions instead of details. A pressure built behind my eyes. I stood up and walked out of the booth, carrying the logbook with me. I don't remember deciding to take it. It felt necessary, like bringing identification to a place that already knew who you were. The side door was open. Of course it was. Inside, the hallway welcomed me without sound. My footsteps didn't echo this time. The building felt closer, tighter, like it was holding its breath with me. I followed the corridor past the sealed rooms, past the welded doors and dark windows. I didn't stop to look inside. I already knew what I'd find. At the end of the hall was a door I hadn't seen before. Wood, not metal, painted a dull green. A small plaque hung crookedly at eye level. Records. The door opened easily. The room beyond was larger than I expected, lined floor to ceiling with shelves. Boxes sat stacked in careful rows, each labeled with dates and numbers. The air smelled of paper and something faintly sweet like old perfume. I set the logbook down on a table in the center and began opening boxes. Files, hundreds of them, thousands, patient histories, staff notes, incident reports. The deeper I went, the more familiar the language felt. Phrases repeated, patterns emerged, words like return, recognition, compliance. Then I found my file. It wasn't thick, just a few pages clipped together. The paper was yellowed, edges soft with age. My name was typed at the top, date of birth. I read it twice, then a third time. It was correct. The photo attached made my hands shake. It showed me standing in front of the asylum, younger, thinner, eyes tired but calm. The same expression from the photograph in the sealed room. I sat down hard in the chair behind me. The notes were brief. Subject exhibits recurring return behavior. Leaves voluntarily. Re-enters during periods of instability. Building response positive. I flipped the page. Memory degradation between returns increases. I felt something shift inside me, like a piece sliding into place. The pressure behind my eyes eased, replaced by a dull understanding that felt heavier. I hadn't taken this job for the first time. I had come back. A sound moved through the building then. Not the hum, something deeper, a settling like a long exhale. I felt it in the floor, in the walls, in my chest. I wasn't scared. That terrified me. I walked back into the hallway, carrying the file now, holding it against me like proof. The lights overhead flickered on, one by one, illuminating the corridor in a soft, yellow glow. It felt wrong and right at the same time. As I passed the sealed rooms, I felt eyes on me, not watching, recognizing. I stopped in front of one door. I don't know how I chose it, I just knew. My room. The window showed the same bed, the same table. The blue comb sat where I remembered it. The blanket was folded neatly, waiting. A memory surfaced then, clear and sharp. Sitting on that bed, listening. Feeling the noise in my head quiet for the first time in years. The building speaking without words, offering shape to thoughts that had been loose and painful. I understood why I'd left before, and why I'd come back. The building didn't trap people. It held them when they couldn't hold themselves. I stepped away from the door and returned to the booth as dawn began to creep into the sky. I placed the file back in its box. I returned the logbook to the desk. Before leaving, I added one last entry. Back again. The ink dried quickly. When I walked out through the gate, it stayed open behind me. It always would. I know I'll leave again someday. That's how it goes. I'll forget details. I'll build a life somewhere else. I'll convince myself the asylum was just a job, just a building. But when the noise returns, when the world loses its edges, I'll find my way back. I always do. My name is already listed. I chose that floor because everyone else avoided it. The building was an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the edge of the city, sealed for years but recently reopened for historical research. I was there to document patient wards before the place was finally torn down. Most researchers stayed on the lower levels, where damage and graffiti made things feel familiar, normal, loud, even in silence. The quietest floor was the fourth. No broken glass up there. No spray paint. No signs of squatters or explorers. Just a long corridor, clean in a way that felt accidental, like no one had disturbed it because no one had wanted to stay long enough. The first time I stepped off the stairwell onto that floor, I noticed how my footsteps sounded wrong. Not softer, not louder, just absorbed. The sound didn't echo, it didn't travel. It felt like the hallway took it in and kept it. That should have been my warning. I was there to record observations, so I spoke into my audio recorder as I walked. Simple notes: layout, condition, atmosphere. My voice sounded thin in my own ears, like it was being held back before reaching the microphone. The ward lights were long dead, but enough daylight came through the tall windows to paint the floor in pale gray strips. Dust lay untouched. Doors stood open, leading into patient rooms that were almost identical. Bed frames bolted down. Small sinks. A chair in the corner of each room. Everything felt paused. I remember thinking the silence was impressive. Not peaceful. Controlled. Like the kind of quiet that comes after someone says something important and everyone waits to see what happens next. About halfway down the hall, I stopped. I couldn't explain why at first. My body just slowed, then froze. I listened, holding my breath. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not close, not loud, just enough to notice. A slow, steady rhythm rising and falling somewhere far down the corridor. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't strained. It sounded calm, resting. I told myself it had to be the building. Air moving through vents. Old ducts settling. But the sound had shape, pattern. A pause between inhale and exhale that felt intentional. I stood there longer than I meant to, recorder still running, my finger tight around it. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't get louder. It stayed exactly the same, like it didn't care whether I was listening or not. I whispered into the recorder, possible airflow noise, investigate source. My voice sounded wrong up there, too loud. I lowered it without thinking. I followed the sound slowly, counting my steps to keep myself steady. 10, 20, 30. The breathing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Each time I thought I was closer, it felt farther away. The doors to the rooms were open, all except one. It stood out immediately. A single closed door near the end of the ward. White paint chipped at the handle. A small observation window at eye level, dark behind the glass. The breathing felt closest there. I stood in front of the door, my heart beating slow but heavy. I didn't feel scared yet, just focused. Curious in a way that felt hollow. I put my ear near the door. The breathing was clearer now, deep, calm, like someone asleep. I knocked. The sound felt violent in that quiet. It echoed inside my skull more than in the hall. The breathing didn't stop. If anything, it felt more aware, like it had noticed the interruption but didn't feel the need to respond. I told myself I was imagining it. I reached for the handle. It was locked. That made sense. Some rooms had been sealed for safety. Still, something about it bothered me. The lock looked newer than the others I'd seen. Clean, recently oiled. I stepped back and checked the number plate beside the door. No number. All the other rooms were numbered. The breathing shifted then, just slightly. A longer inhale, a slower exhale. I became very aware of my own breath and tried to match it without knowing why. That's when I noticed something else. The floor beneath the door was clean. No dust line, no debris. Like the door had been opened recently, often. I backed away. The silence pressed in harder now, like it didn't like being disturbed. The breathing continued, steady and patient. I felt like I was the one out of place. I turned and walked back toward the stairwell, forcing myself not to hurry. My recorder felt warm in my hand, like it had been running too long. I stopped speaking into it. I didn't want my voice on the tape anymore. Halfway down the hall, I heard another sound. A second breath. Closer this time. Not behind me, beside me. I stopped, slowly turned my head toward one of the open rooms. The bed inside was empty. The chair faced the wall, nothing moved. But the breathing was there, soft, near. I stood very still. My skin prickled. I felt watched, not with eyes, but with attention. Like the ward itself was aware of where I stood, how fast my heart beat, how shallow my breath had become. The sound faded as I reached the stairwell. Not abruptly. It drifted away like someone rolling over in sleep. I didn't go back to the 4th floor that day. That night back in my hotel room, I listened to the recording. Most of it was normal. My voice, footsteps, silence. Then about 30 minutes in, I heard it. Breathing. Clearer than I remembered. Close to the microphone. Under my voice, under my footsteps, steady and calm. At one point, it sounded like it adjusted to match my pace. Near the end of the recording, just before I turned back, there was a pause. A long inhale. A slow exhale. And then, very faintly, my name. Not spoken, breathed. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the building map. There was no sealed room on the 4th floor. No unnumbered door. But when I went back that afternoon, the door was open. The room was empty. And the silence was deeper than before. I went back to the 4th floor the next morning, even though every part of me argued against it. I told myself I needed to finish my documentation, that skipping a floor would raise questions later, that fear wasn't a good enough reason to leave a job unfinished. All of that sounded reasonable when I said it out loud. None of it felt true. The stairwell door opened onto the ward without a sound. The same pale light lay across the floor, the same clean dust, the same quiet that felt thick enough to touch. But something was different. The silence wasn't waiting anymore. It felt occupied. I stepped into the corridor slowly, my shoes making almost no noise. The air felt warmer than the day before, not by much, just enough to notice, like a room someone had just left. I told myself old buildings trap heat. That was normal. Still, I rubbed my arms as I walked. The open door I'd seen the day before was still open. The room beyond looked unchanged. Empty bed frame, chair, sink, nothing out of place. I stood in the doorway for a long time listening. No breathing this time, just the low, endless quiet. I moved on. Halfway down the hall, I noticed the first sign. It was subtle, easy to miss. The mattress in one of the rooms wasn't flat. I stepped closer, my heart slowing instead of speeding up. The indentation wasn't deep, but it was clear. A shallow dip near the center, like someone had been lying there recently. The dust around the bed was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks. I reached out without thinking and hovered my hand above the mattress. Warm. I pulled my hand back quickly like I'd touched something alive. The warmth wasn't imagined. It wasn't leftover from sunlight. The window was on the other side of the room. The bed was in shadow. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to understand what I was feeling. Old buildings don't hold warmth like that. Not evenly. Not quietly. I backed out of the room and checked the next one. Another bed, another shallow impression, another patch of warmth. My thoughts began to drift, slipping sideways instead of lining up the way they should. I felt calm in a way that didn't belong to me, like the building was helping me stay steady, easing my reactions before they could grow sharp. I whispered, "That's not possible," but the words felt thin. In the third room, the blanket was folded at the foot of the bed. Neat, careful, the kind of fold you make when you expect to come back later. The mattress there was warm too. I started checking rooms one by one, slower now. Every few beds showed the same signs. A pillow slightly turned, a sheet pulled tight, the faint, lingering warmth of a body that hadn't been gone long. No smell of decay, no damp, just clean air and quiet order. I stopped counting after 10. That was when I noticed the chairs. Most of them faced the walls the way they had been left decades ago. but in 3 rooms, the chairs were turned toward the beds, close, as if placed for someone watching over another person while they slept. The breathing returned then. Soft, far away, more than one rhythm this time. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound didn't come from any single room. It moved through the floor, the walls, the space between rooms, calm, unhurried, together. I felt my own breathing begin to slow, drawn into the pattern without effort. It felt good. That scared me. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. The cold of the concrete helped a little. I focused on it, on the weight of my body, on the fact that I was awake. A memory surfaced without warning. Lying in bed as a child, sick, listening to someone breathe in the room with me. Not fear, comfort, the knowledge that I wasn't alone. The memory felt too clear, too close. I stood up quickly and turned back toward the stairwell. That's when I saw the last room. I hadn't noticed it before. The door stood open wider than the others. Inside, the bed was made, not hospital type, but gently. The kind of messy neatness that comes from habit. A glass of water sat on the small table beside it. Clear, no dust on the rim. I stepped inside. The room felt warmer than the rest of the floor. Not stifling, just lived in. The mattress held a deep impression, still warm, still shaped like someone who had just stood up. The pillow was indented too. I reached out and touched the edge of the bed. The warmth soaked into my fingers. I didn't pull away this time. The breathing here was closest, right beside me. I could feel it more than hear it. The rise and fall of something steady and calm. I whispered, "Who's here?" No answer, just the breathing. Then something shifted behind me. Not movement, attention. I felt the urge to lie down, strong and sudden. A thought slid into my mind, fully formed, gentle and convincing. "You're tired." It felt true, deeply true. My legs ached. My head felt heavy. The bed looked inviting in a way no abandoned bed ever should. I sat down on the edge before I realized I'd done it. The warmth rose through my clothes, settling into me. The breathing slowed, matched mine. Or maybe I matched it, I couldn't tell anymore. I lay back. For a moment everything was quiet inside my head. The usual noise faded. Thoughts loosened their grip. I understood then why people might have stayed, why leaving could feel harder than staying. Something brushed against my hand. Not a touch, a presence, like another hand resting nearby, close enough to feel but not see. I sat up sharply, the spell breaking all at once. My heart raced now, too fast, my breath uneven. The room felt colder suddenly, like it had lost interest. I stood and backed toward the door. The breathing didn't follow. As I left the room, I noticed something written faintly on the wall above the bed. Letters scratched lightly into the paint, barely visible. "Rest here." I didn't document any of this. I left the 4th floor without looking back, my steps louder now, the silence pressing against them. In the stairwell, the noise of my own movement felt shocking, wrong, like I was breaking a rule. That night in my hotel room, I lay awake listening to my own breathing. It didn't sound like mine. It was too calm, too steady. And when I finally slept, I dreamed of warm beds lined up in a quiet hall, waiting patiently for someone to come back and lie down again. I found the files in a drawer that did not want to open. The metal was bent, and the handle felt warm, like it had been held not long ago. I told myself that buildings remember heat. That was my excuse. I pulled anyway, slow, careful, like I was asking permission. Inside were folders the color of old teeth. They smelled like dust and medicine. The labels were written by hand, names pressed hard into paper, as if the writer had been angry or afraid. I sat on the floor and read because the chair nearby was broken, its legs cut short, like someone wanted it to kneel. These were patient records from the last years before the ward closed. I had seen others like them before. This was my work. Dates, symptoms, notes about progress or decline. But something felt wrong as soon as I started reading. The endings were missing. Many files stopped mid-sentence. Others ended with the same phrase, written again and again in different handwriting. Declared deceased, time of death recorded, body to be released, and then nothing. No burial notes, no transfer forms, no signatures. At first I thought the rest had been lost. Fire, flood, careless hands. That happens in old places. But the more I read, the more the pattern pressed in. Every patient declared dead on this floor had no record beyond that moment. No graves, no ashes, no family notices. It was like they slipped out of the world between lines of ink. I took notes in my journal, writing slower than usual. I kept listening while I read. The silence here was never empty. It had a shape. It wrapped around my ears. And under it, very far away, was that breathing again. Long, tired breaths, like someone sleeping through pain. One file caught my attention because it was thick. Years of notes. A man who refused to answer questions. A woman who spoke only to corners. A boy who would not lie down because he said the bed was already taken. All three were marked dead on the same day. I checked the date. I checked it again. They had died decades apart. That made no sense. I flipped through the pages faster, my heart starting to move too quickly. The handwriting changed with time, but the final note was the same. Same words, same slant, same heavy pressure on the page, declared deceased. I stood up and felt dizzy. The hallway outside the room seemed longer than before. The lights from my torch did not reach the end. I thought of the beds I had seen earlier, sheets pulled tight, pillows dented like heads had just lifted from them. I told myself this was a trick of stress. Long hours, old air, too much imagination. That is what I wrote in my journal, though my hand was shaking. I went deeper into the records room. There was a shelf behind a curtain I had not noticed before. The fabric was stiff with age and smelled like damp skin. Behind it were boxes with no labels at all. Inside were photographs. They were black and white, curled at the edges. Patients standing in rows. Patients sitting on beds. Patients staring straight into the lens with eyes that looked too awake. On the back of each photo was a name and a date. Some of the dates were recent. One photo showed a woman I recognized. I had passed her room earlier. The bed with the warm sheet, the dented pillow. Her eyes in the picture were open wide, her mouth slightly parted like she was about to speak. The date on the back was from 50 years ago. I dropped the photo and felt the floor vibrate. Not a sound, just a soft movement like something shifting its weight. The breathing grew louder, closer, no longer distant. It came from the walls, from the floor, from inside my chest. I wanted to leave. That thought came fully formed, clear and sharp. But my feet did not move. I felt watched in a way I could not explain, not from behind or ahead, but from below, as if the building itself was aware of me reading its secrets. I found one more file. It was thinner than the rest. No name on the front. Inside was a single page. It was a report written by a junior doctor. He described patients who refused to accept death. Not fear of dying, refusal. They would stop breathing, hearts would stop, and then hours later they would return, sitting up, asking for water, complaining of cold. The doctor wrote that the bodies could not be buried because they would not stay dead. That phrase was underlined twice. He wrote that after a while, administration ordered silence. No more reports, no more notes, just the final declaration. Declared deceased. I closed the file and heard footsteps above me. Slow, bare, moving in no hurry at all. The ceiling creaked with each step. Dust fell like dry snow. I whispered hello without meaning to. My voice sounded wrong here, thin and stretched. The footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped too. For a moment the silence was complete. It pressed so hard my ears rang. Then I felt it. a warmth spreading through the floor, through the soles of my shoes, like lying in a bed someone else had just left. I backed away, bumping into a shelf. The photos slid and fell, faces turning upward, eyes open, waiting. I understood then that no one had been buried because no one had left. They stayed because this place held them, or because it would not let them go. As I reached the door, the breathing started again all around me now. Not one person, many, slow and patient. I did not run. Running felt wrong, like it would wake them. I left the records behind. I did not take proof. I did not need it anymore. The warmth followed me into the hall, into the quietest floor, into my memory. Even now, when I lie down at night, I feel it. A bed already warm, a space already taken, and beneath my own breathing, steady and calm, I sometimes hear another rhythm, waiting for me to stop. The power went out without warning. One moment the hallway lights hummed above me, thin and tired, and the next they were gone. Not a flicker, not a fade, just gone. Darkness settled like a heavy blanket, soft but absolute. My torch was in my hand already, but I did not turn it on right away. I don't know why. Something in me wanted to listen first. The ward did not sound empty anymore. There was a low shift in the air, like a room full of people adjusting in their seats at the same time. Beds creaked, not loud, just enough to notice. Fabric brushed against fabric, a slow sound, careful, like movement meant to stay hidden. I turned on the torch. The beam cut a narrow path through the dark. The walls looked closer now, the ceiling lower. Shadows pressed in from every side, bending in ways that didn't feel natural. The floor reflected the light faintly, like damp stone, though I knew it was dry. I told myself the outage was normal. Old buildings lose power, storms pass, wires rot. That was the calm voice I used when my heart started beating too hard. As I walked, the silence followed me, but it was different now. Alert, listening. I reached the patient rooms one by one, doors standing open like waiting mouths. Inside, the beds were still lined up neatly, sheets pulled high, pillows placed just right. Nothing looked disturbed. That almost made it worse. Order can feel more frightening than chaos when you don't understand who keeps it. I stepped into the first room. The torch light slid over the nearest bed, then the next. I paused when I saw the third. The sheet was slightly raised in the center, as if something beneath it was breathing. Slow, gentle. The rise and fall matched the rhythm I had heard before. I stood very still. The sheet did not move again. I waited longer than felt comfortable. My arm began to ache from holding the torch steady. Finally, I told myself it was air, old vents, my imagination filling in gaps. I backed out of the room without turning my back on the beds. In the hallway, the darkness felt thicker. The beam of light seemed weaker now, like the building was swallowing it. I noticed something else then. The beds at the far end of the hall were no longer empty. I don't mean people were sitting up. I don't mean shapes or figures. I mean the beds felt occupied. The way a room feels different when someone else is inside it, even if you can't see them. I moved closer, each step slow, measured. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. I tried to quiet it, but fear has its own volume. As I passed one bed, I felt eyes on me. Not a stare, not sharp or focused, just awareness, like something knew where I was without needing to look. The feeling crawled up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. I whispered to myself again, just to hear a human sound. My voice felt thin, stretched across the dark. That was when I realized something important. The breathing was not coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the beds. Each one had its own rhythm, some slow and deep, some shallow, almost tired. One had a slight hitch, like pain held back. Together they formed a soft, uneven pattern, like a room full of sleepers. I did not want to shine the light directly on them. I knew that instinct was wrong, but it was strong. Children know when not to look under beds. Adults forget, but the fear stays. The power outage had changed the ward. Without the hum of electricity, it felt awake in a different way, no longer pretending to be empty, no longer pretending to be still. I reached the nurse's station at the end of the hall. The desk was cold when I touched it. Papers lay scattered, exactly as they had been earlier, but now they seemed watched too, like objects that remembered hands. Behind the desk was a small mirror, cracked down the middle. I did not mean to look into it. The torch slipped and the light caught my reflection. My face looked pale, eyes too wide, mouth slightly open. For a moment I thought that was all I saw. Then I noticed the eyes behind me. They were not in the mirror as shapes. They were impressions, darker patches in the dark where light should have been, lined up low at bed height. Watching. I turned around too fast. The beam swept across the beds in one sharp movement. The sheets lay flat again. Perfect, smooth, no movement at all. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was not calm. It was tense, like a held breath. I realized then that whatever was here did not like the light, or maybe it didn't like being seen. I lowered the torch slightly, not turning it off but softening it. The beam widened less sharp. The breathing returned. Closer now. I felt a strange sadness wash over me then, not my own. It felt borrowed, heavy, old, like lying awake for years with no one to notice. The beds felt lonely. The ward felt lonely. And beneath that loneliness was anger, quiet and deep. I spoke without planning to. I told them I was sorry. I don't know who they were, but the word fit. I said I was only here to listen, to remember. The breathing slowed. One bed creaked softly, just once. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, like someone sitting up carefully, trying not to wake the others. My torch flickered. That scared me more than anything else so far. Darkness without choice is different from darkness by design. I held the torch tighter, willing it to stay. A shape formed at the edge of the light. Not a body, just a deeper dark. It leaned forward slightly as if curious. I did not move. I did not speak. In that moment, I understood the truth of this place. The patients had not refused to leave because they were alive. They refused because no one told them they could rest. The power did not come back on while I was there. I left the ward slowly, respectfully, like leaving a room full of sleepers. The breathing followed me to the stairs, then faded, one by one. When the lights finally returned later, the ward felt empty again. Cold, silent, dead in the way buildings pretend to be. But I know what it feels like when the lights go out. And I know the beds keep their eyes open. The hospital looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. I'd seen condemned buildings before. Old factories, empty schools, places where the city had decided the cost of repair was too high. But this hospital felt different. It wasn't just abandoned. It was put away, like a drawer that was closed and never meant to be opened again. I walked up the cracked steps and pushed the front door. It didn't fight me. It didn't even complain. It just opened like it had been waiting. The air inside was cold, but not the cold of outside. It was a cold that belonged to rooms that never warmed up again. The smell was the first thing that hit me. Old medicine, dust, something metallic underneath, like blood that had dried years ago and still remembered it was wet. I kept my flashlight in my hand, though the sun was still up. My job was simple: catalog the files, put them in boxes, label them, move them to storage. That was it. No one said anything about the way the building made you feel like you were being watched. The security guard at the entrance gave me a clipboard and a key ring with one key. He looked at me like he was doing me a favor, like I was the kind of person who needed a favor. "You're sure you want to do this?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the empty lobby. He nodded like he'd heard that before. "Basement is where the old records are. Don't go anywhere else. And don't stay too long, it gets heavy." "What does that mean?" I asked. He hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the hallway. "It means the air gets thick, like it wants to hold you, like the building doesn't want to let you leave. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. A smile felt like a tool you used when you didn't know the words. He didn't smile back. He just locked the door behind me. The main hallway was long and narrow, and the light from my flashlight bounced off the tiles in a thin strip. Everything else was darkness. The walls were stained, but not from water or smoke. These stains looked like hands had pressed there and left marks that never fully washed away. I followed the sign to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight. Each step felt like a small complaint. The deeper I went, the colder it became. My breath started to fog in front of me. At the bottom, the air smelled even more like old paper. The basement was a maze of rooms and shelves and metal cabinets. The kind of place where sound disappears quickly. The kind of place where you can stand still and feel like you are not alone, even when no one is around. There were boxes everywhere, some stacked neatly, some thrown in piles. The labels were faded. Many of them had been written by hand, in a hurried script that looked like it was made by someone who didn't want to remember what they were writing. I set my bag down and pulled out my clipboard. The first task was to identify what kind of records these were: patient files, administrative notes, old charts. I was supposed to catalog them and decide what could be kept and what needed to be destroyed. I picked up the first file. The paper was brittle. The ink was faded. The patient's name was written at the top, but the rest of the page was a mess of notes, dates, and strange marks that looked like someone had been circling certain words over and over again. I read one line and then another. The notes were clinical at first, standard descriptions of symptoms and treatment, but the deeper I read, the more the words felt wrong. Not wrong in a grammatical way, wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten. The patient was described as responsive, then unresponsive, then responsive again. The doctor's notes said the patient complained of voices in the walls, and then later wrote that the patient stopped speaking entirely, but the voices continued. I stared at the page longer than I should have. I kept thinking about the guard's words. Heavy air. A building that didn't want to let you leave. It sounded like a story, a rumor, something people said to keep themselves from going too deep into a place they knew was dangerous. But I was here. I was already in the basement. I put the file down and moved to the next box. The labels on the boxes didn't follow any order. Some were marked with dates, some with departments, some with names. It felt like whoever had packed them had been in a hurry, like they had been running out of time. I opened another box and pulled out a stack of folders. The first one had a patient's name written in bold letters. Underneath, in smaller writing, was a note. Transferred to Isolation Ward, 1979. Isolation Ward. The words made my skin prickle. I had worked in hospitals before. I knew what isolation meant. It meant fear. It meant patients that the staff didn't want near others. It meant people who had been set aside, out of sight. I opened the folder. The first page was a photo. It was a small black and white picture of a patient sitting on a bed. The face was blurred, like someone had smeared the image on purpose. The person's hands were clasped tightly together. The eyes looked like they were staring straight at the camera. The photo made my throat tighten. I turned the page. The next page was a note from a doctor. It was dated, but the date looked wrong. The ink was darker than the rest of the paper, like it had been written later, like someone had added it after the file had already been closed. The note read, "The patient reports the building is speaking to them. The patient says the building is hungry. The patient refuses to leave. The patient is calm. The patient is satisfied." Satisfied. The word sat in my mind like a stone. I felt my flashlight shake in my hand. I didn't notice I was holding it tightly until I realized my knuckles were white. I took a breath and tried to calm myself. I told myself these were just old records. Someone wrote these notes. Someone was trying to explain a patient's illness. I put the folder back into the box and forced myself to move on. The deeper I went into the basement, the more boxes I found that were not labeled in any logical way. Some had no labels at all. Some were marked with a single word: hold, do not open, restricted. I found one box that was sealed with thick tape. It had a label on it, but the label was torn in half. The part that remained said, "Confidential, do not." I stared at it. I felt an urge to open it, like something inside me wanted to see what had been hidden. It wasn't curiosity. It was more like a pull, like the building was asking me to look. I didn't open it. Instead, I moved to another box. I told myself I was being sensible. I was doing my job. I was not here to satisfy a building's desires. But the basement was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful, not empty, just waiting. I worked for a while longer. I cataloged patient names, dates, notes. I wrote them down carefully because I was trained to do things carefully. I was trained to treat records like they mattered. I found files that described patients who had been admitted for depression, for anxiety, for hallucinations. I found notes about treatments that were cruel and outdated. I found paperwork about patients who had disappeared. The more I read, the more the basement seemed to change. The air felt thicker. The shadows seemed closer. The light from my flashlight looked dimmer, like the building was swallowing it. Every sound I made echoed, but not like normal echoes. It sounded like the building was repeating me, like it was listening and then answering in its own way. I began to hear something else. At first I thought it was the pipes. Old buildings always make noise, but this was different. It sounded like breathing. Slow, deep breathing, like someone sleeping. I stopped moving. The breathing stopped too. I waited. The breathing returned, but it was farther away now, like it was moving through the walls. I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my back. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the basement was full of old pipes and my mind was making stories. But the breathing was real. It was too steady to be my imagination. I turned off my flashlight for a moment just to see how dark it was. The basement swallowed the light instantly. My eyes adjusted slowly, but I could still see a faint outline of the boxes and shelves. In the dark, the air felt closer, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned my flashlight back on. Nothing was behind me, but the boxes looked different. The labels on the boxes were now facing me in a way they hadn't been before, like they had been turned. I stood very still and listened. The breathing was still there. Closer. And then I heard something else. A soft sound like paper being moved. A file sliding out of a box. I turned toward the sound. A folder was lying on the floor. I had not dropped it. It was not in my hands. I had not touched it. The folder lay there open. The paper inside was blank. But there was a line written at the top, in a handwriting I recognized immediately. My name. It was written in the same dark ink as the note in the isolation ward file. My heart started to beat too fast. I stepped closer, but my body felt heavy, like I was walking through water, like the building was pushing back. I reached down and picked up the folder. The paper inside was still blank, but as I held it, the ink began to appear. Slowly, like someone was writing it in the air. The words formed right before my eyes. I watched them appear. I watched my own name be written again. And beneath it, a date. A date that was not today. A date that was decades ago. A date that made my stomach drop. I don't know how long I stood there. I don't know how long the basement watched me. But when I finally looked up, I realized something that made my blood go cold. The boxes around me were no longer stacked in disorder. They were arranged in rows. Neat rows. Like they had been waiting for me to arrive. like the building had been organizing itself while I worked. And I realized then, in the quiet basement, with the old files breathing around me, the hospital had been waiting. And I was not here to catalog records. I was here to be remembered. The first time I read the phrase unregistered treatment, I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, a doctor's handwriting that had been misread by someone who was tired or careless. But the more files I opened, the more I realized it wasn't a mistake at all. It was a label. It was a warning. It was a confession. The hospital had a way of keeping secrets, not just in locked rooms or hidden closets, in paperwork, in dates, in the way certain words were written and then crossed out. The first file I opened after the basement incident was a patient record from the early 1970s. The patient's name was listed at the top, along with their diagnosis, schizophrenia. Under that, the doctor's note said unregistered treatment. I stared at those words for a long time. The ink was dark and bold, like whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. The rest of the page was filled with notes about the patient's condition. The patient was described as agitated, uncooperative, prone to delusions. But there was something else. A small note in the margin, almost like an afterthought. It said, she said the building was listening. She said it wanted to be fed. The words felt wrong, like they belonged to a story someone made up to scare children. But this was not a story. This was a file, a record, a real person. I turned the page. The next note was from a nurse. It described a procedure that wasn't on any official list. It wasn't in any standard treatment manual. It wasn't even in the patient's consent form. It said the patient had been administered a low dose of electrical stimulation while restrained. It didn't say why. It didn't say what the goal was. It didn't say who ordered it. Just unregistered treatment. I felt my skin tighten. I thought of the building, the way it had seemed to rearrange the boxes after I had been reading, the way the air had thickened, the way the breathing had sounded like it was coming from the walls. I wondered if the building had been more than a place, if it had been something that fed on people. The next file I opened was worse. This one wasn't labeled as a patient record. It was a report, a memorandum. It was addressed to the hospital administration. It said in plain language that the hospital had been conducting experimental treatments without approval, that the treatments were not listed in official records, that the patients had not consented. The report was written with the kind of calm that made it feel even colder. It was the kind of document someone wrote when they were trying to protect themselves, when they were trying to make sure their own name stayed clean. The report ended with a sentence that made my heart slow down. It said the treatments have not stopped. They cannot be stopped. The building will not allow it. I read that sentence again. The building will not allow it. I sat back on my heels and pressed my palm to the cold concrete floor. The basement felt like it was holding its breath. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Buildings don't have will. Buildings don't stop people. Buildings don't decide what happens. But the words were there. The handwriting was there. The evidence was there. I opened another file. This one was different. It was newer. It looked like it had been added after the hospital was closed. The paper was not as yellow. The ink was not as faded. It had been filed incorrectly, like someone had tried to hide it. The patient's name was not listed. Instead, there was a code. Subject 14. Under that, a note: the subject remained stable. The building remained satisfied. I swallowed hard. Stable, satisfied. The file contained a description of a procedure that sounded like something out of a nightmare. It described a treatment where the patient was placed in a room with no windows, no sound, no light. The patient was given medication that made them sleep. Then the room was sealed. Not for hours. Not for days. For weeks, the report said the goal was to observe the subject's response to extended sensory deprivation. The file included drawings, not professional diagrams, scribbled sketches, the kind of drawings someone makes when they are trying to remember something that scared them. The drawings showed a room with a bed that was bolted to the floor, a small window at the top of the wall. The window had bars. The sketches were labeled with numbers. The numbers looked like dates, but they were not dates I recognized. They were far in the future. I stared at them until my eyes hurt. I looked around the basement, half expecting to see a room like that somewhere nearby, half expecting to see a door that hadn't been there before. Nothing. Just boxes, shelves, dust. But the air felt different. The building felt closer. I opened the next file. This one was a patient record, but it didn't have a name. It was labeled only with the word return. The note said the patient had been brought back to the hospital after leaving. The staff described the patient as calm, compliant, quiet. The patient had no memory of leaving. The patient claimed the hospital was their home. The patient claimed they had never been outside. The patient claimed they had been called back. I read that line over and over again. Called back. Like a doorbell. Like a voice. Like something that had been waiting. The file ended with a note from a doctor. The doctor wrote that the patient's condition was improving, but the patient's eyes looked hollow. The doctor said the patient was better, but the doctor's handwriting looked shaky. The last sentence was the one that made me stop breathing. It said the patient is no longer a patient. The patient is now a resident. Resident. Not a patient. Not someone receiving care. Someone living there. I closed the file and put it down carefully. I didn't want to touch it more than I had to. The basement was quiet again, too quiet. The breathing had stopped. The air felt heavy, like a blanket had been pulled over my head. I stood up slowly. My legs felt stiff. My back felt sore from sitting on the cold floor. I walked to the nearest shelf and reached for a box. I wanted to keep working. I wanted to tell myself that I was here to do a job. But as I pulled the box toward me, I noticed something. The label on the box was fresh. It wasn't faded like the others. The ink was dark and new. The label read, "Unregistered treatments." I stared at it. My hands started to shake. I didn't remember writing that label. I didn't remember touching that box. I didn't remember putting it on the shelf. But the label was there, clear as day. I opened the box. Inside were folders, lots of them, more than I expected, each one labeled with a different subject number. Subject 1, Subject 2, Subject 3. And then near the bottom, a folder labeled Subject 14. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to touch it, but something in me wanted to know. I pulled the folder out. The paper inside was thick. It wasn't the same paper as the other files. It felt like it had been stored carefully, like someone wanted it to last. The first page was a list of names. Not patient names. Staff names. Doctors, nurses, administrators. The list was long. It included the names of people who had worked at the hospital decades ago. And at the bottom of the list was a name I recognized. My name. It was written in the same dark ink as the note about the building being satisfied. My name followed by a date. The date was the same one I had seen in the blank folder in the other box. The date that was decades old. The date that made me feel like I was standing in a place that had already decided I was here. My hands trembled. I felt like I was going to be sick. I put the folder down and stepped back. The basement seemed to shift. The shadows moved, just slightly, as if something had turned its head. I felt for the first time the sense that I wasn't alone. Not because I heard something, but because I felt something watching, something patient, something that had been waiting. I looked at the box labeled unregistered treatments again, and I realized with a cold certainty that this was not just a place where records were stored. This was a place where something was kept, something that had been hidden, something that had never stopped. The building had been treating people, and it had never stopped. It had only changed its methods. It had only changed its names. It had only changed its victims. And now I was here, in the basement, with the files, with the names, with the date, with the sense that the building was not just a place. It was a living thing, and it was still hungry. The files in the basement felt like a mouth full of teeth. Every time I pulled one out, I felt like I was taking a bite of something that had been hidden for too long, something that had been chewed and swallowed and never fully digested. The basement was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that makes your ears feel full, like the silence is pressing against your eardrums. I sat at a small table I found tucked behind some shelves. The table was dusty, but stable. It felt like it had been waiting for someone to use it again. I opened the folder labeled Subject 14 and began to read. The notes were different from the other records. They weren't clinical. They weren't written in neat lines. They looked like someone had been writing quickly, as if they were trying to get the words down before they disappeared. The patient's name was at the top. It was written clearly in black ink. Then the next line was crossed out. Not with a single line, with many lines, like someone had tried to erase the name completely. But the ink was dark, and the name still showed through. I leaned closer. The name was familiar. It was the name of someone I had never met. But the name had the same letters as my own. Not my full name, just the first name. The same first name. I felt a chill run through me. I flipped the page. The next entry was a note from a nurse. It described a patient's behavior. The patient was described as calm. The patient was described as quiet. The patient was described as content. Then the nurse wrote something that didn't fit with the rest of the sentence. The nurse wrote, "The patient was not present when the staff came in." The nurse circled the word "not" and underlined it. Then the nurse crossed out the entire sentence. The nurse wrote a new sentence beneath it. The patient was present, but the word present was crossed out too. And then a new word was written. Absent. I stared at the page until my eyes burned. I couldn't tell if the nurse had changed their mind or if someone had forced them to change it. I couldn't tell if the nurse was trying to hide something or if the nurse had been afraid. I turned the page. This time the patient's name was not crossed out, but the writing was different. The letters were shaky, like the person writing them was afraid of being seen. The notes described the patient's disappearance. The patient had been in a room. The patient had been there the night before. The patient had been counted in the morning. Then during the day, the patient was gone. The staff searched the building. They searched the grounds. They searched the nearby woods. No sign of the patient. The note said the patient had vanished. Then the note said something that made my skin crawl. It said, "The building recorded the patient as still present." I read that line again. The building recorded the patient as still present. Like the building had its own system, its own way of keeping track, its own memory. I looked around the basement, half expecting to see a camera or a monitor, half expecting to see a machine with blinking lights. There was nothing. Just boxes, dust, old paper. I turned the page again. This entry was worse. The patient's name was there, written in thick ink. But the rest of the page was empty. No notes, no dates, no details. Just the name, Then halfway down the page, there was a single sentence written in small letters. They were here. The sentence was crossed out, not with a neat line, with messy, frantic scribbles, like someone had tried to scratch it away. But the sentence still showed through. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was reading something I wasn't supposed to read. Like I was looking at a secret that was still alive. I closed the folder and sat back. My hands were shaking. The basement felt colder. The air felt thicker. The silence felt heavier. I tried to tell myself that this was just paperwork, that these were just old records, that the hospital had a history of mistakes and poor record keeping. But the way the names were crossed out made it feel like the building was doing something to them, like it was erasing them, not from the world, from memory, from existence. I opened another folder. This one was labeled with a date. The date was from the late 1960s. The patient's name was written at the top. The notes were written in neat lines. The handwriting was calm and steady. Then halfway down the page, the writing stopped. Not because the patient's treatment ended. Not because the file ended. Because the page ended. The note simply stopped mid-sentence. The last words were, "Patient reports voices in the..." And then nothing. The sentence was cut off. The next line was blank. The next page was blank too. The entire rest of the folder was blank. Like the file had been ripped out. Like someone had taken the rest of the record and removed it. I flipped through the folder again slowly. I checked the pages to see if they had been torn. But the pages were intact. They were blank. The paper was there. But the words were not. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed. I thought of the building. I thought of the basement. I thought of the files that had been arranged neatly while I wasn't looking. I thought of the breathing. I thought of the feeling of being watched. I opened the next folder. This one was labeled with a patient name, and under it, a note in red ink. The red ink stood out among the black and faded blue. It looked fresh, like someone had written it recently. The note said, "Do not allow the patient to leave." Then the note continued in smaller writing. "The building will not allow the patient to leave." The red ink made the words feel urgent, like a warning, like a plea. I stared at the note until the letters blurred. I couldn't understand how a note written in red ink could still be here, how it could still look so new, how it could still be so clear. I looked at the date. It was the same date I had seen in the folder labeled Subject 14. The same date I had seen in the blank folder. The same date I had seen next to my name. I felt my stomach twist. I tried to tell myself that this was a coincidence, that the dates were reused, that the hospital had a pattern. But the more I read, the more the pattern felt like a trap. I closed the folder and stood up. My legs felt weak. I needed air. I needed to leave the basement. I needed to get out of the building. I walked toward the stairs. But before I reached them, I noticed something on the floor. A piece of paper. It wasn't from any of the folders I had opened. It looked like it had been dropped recently. The paper was not yellowed. It was not brittle. It was clean. I picked it up. It was a sheet of notebook paper, the kind you might use for notes or a quick list. On it was a single sentence, written in the same dark ink as the old files. "You are not the first to read this." I felt my throat tighten. My hands were cold. I looked around the basement, but there was no one there. Just the shelves, just the boxes, just the quiet. I read the sentence again. "You are not the first to read this." The words made my skin crawl, because it meant someone else had been here. Someone else had read these files. Someone else had known the building was doing something. Someone else had tried to warn me. I looked down at the paper again. There was more writing. A name. Not a patient name. A staff name. A doctor's name. A name I recognized from the list in Subject 14. The name was crossed out, with heavy ink, like someone had tried to erase it, like someone had tried to remove the person from the record. But the name still showed through. And beneath the crossed out name in smaller letters was a note. They are still here. I felt my body go cold. I realized then, with a sudden terrible clarity, what was happening. The names were being crossed out. Not because the people had died. Not because the records were lost. Because the building was removing them. From the world. From memory. From existence. And the more I read, the more I understood that the building was not just a place that held records. It was a place that held people. And the records were only a way for it to keep track. I stared at the crossed-out name on the paper. My mind raced. I thought of the guard at the entrance. I thought of his warning. I thought of the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. I realized, with a sense of dread that felt like a physical weight, that the building had been watching me from the moment I arrived. And now it was keeping track. Now it was making sure I stayed in its records. Now it was making sure I didn't leave. I held the paper tightly in my hand. I felt the ink seep into my skin. And I understood, with a slow, creeping horror, that the building had already begun to erase me. Not from the world, from the pages, from the story, from the memory, from the record, and I wasn't sure if I was still allowed to exist. The basement air was heavy, like a blanket pulled tight over my chest. It had been hours since I arrived, but time didn't feel real down there. The clocks were gone. The lights were dim. The building seemed to move in slow motion, like it was breathing at a different pace than I was. I sat back at the table, the same table I'd been using since the beginning. The paper in my hand felt too thin, like it might tear if I held it too tightly. The files were everywhere. They were stacked, sorted, labeled, and now they felt like they were watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that I'd been reading too much into old notes and faded ink. But then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The folder in front of me was slightly open. Not by much, just a crack, like someone had nudged it. I had closed it, I was sure of it. I looked at my hands, they were steady, they were clean. I hadn't touched the folder in a while. And yet the folder was open. I slowly reached forward and closed it again. It shut with a soft, almost gentle sound. I breathed out. Then I heard a faint noise behind me. Not footsteps. Not a voice. A soft rustle like paper shifting. I turned my head. The shelves behind me were full of boxes. Some were labeled, some were not. One box in particular caught my eye. It was not like the others. It was a plain box. No label, no writing. Just a box that looked like it had been placed there carefully. And the lid was slightly raised, like it had been opened recently. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I stood up slowly and walked toward the box. The floor creaked under my weight, and the sound felt too loud in the quiet basement. I reached the box and looked inside. There were files, not stacked neatly, not arranged, just lying there like someone had tossed them in. One folder sat on top. It was open, and the pages inside were moving. Not like wind moving them. Not like a draft. Like something inside the paper was shifting. Like the pages were breathing. I felt a cold drop of sweat run down my spine. I stepped back. The files in the box were not supposed to move. Files don't move. Paper doesn't move on its own. But the pages in that folder were moving, as if something beneath them was trying to push them up. I stood there for a long moment, staring. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling. I tried to tell myself it was a draft from the stairs. I tried to tell myself anything that would make sense. But the pages kept moving. Slowly, like a heartbeat. I looked closer. There was writing on the page. A patient record. The name at the top was crossed out. Then rewritten. Then crossed out again. It was as if someone was trying to erase the name, and then remembered it was there. I leaned in closer. The ink on the page seemed darker than the others, fresher. It was like the paper had been waiting for someone to read it again. The words on the page were not just notes. They were a story that seemed to be changing as I watched. The sentences shifted, like the words were rearranging themselves. I blinked. When I opened my eyes again, the writing had changed. The patient's name was no longer crossed out. It was written clearly, and beneath it was a note that hadn't been there before. "You are reading me." My breath caught in my throat. I felt my hands go cold. I looked around the basement, but there was no one there. Just the boxes, just the shelves, just the quiet. I looked back at the page. The words were still there. "You are reading me." I felt my heart begin to race. I closed the folder quickly, as if shutting it would stop the words from being there. But the moment I closed it, I heard something. A soft, low sound. Like a whisper. Not from my ears. From the paper. From the file. I opened the folder again slowly. The words were different now. The writing was neat, almost calm. It said, "Thank you for reading." I stared at the page. My mind felt numb. I didn't know if I was tired or if I was losing my mind. I turned the page. The next page was blank. Then slowly, words began to appear, as if someone was writing them with an invisible pen. The words formed right in front of my eyes. "You can't leave." My throat tightened. I closed the folder again. I held it in my hands like it was a hot object. I could feel the paper's warmth. The paper was warm. I didn't understand how that was possible. Paper doesn't have warmth unless something is inside it, unless something is alive. I set the folder down gently. I tried to focus on my breathing. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining it. But the building felt different now. Not just heavy, not just quiet. Aware. Like it knew I was listening. Like it knew I was reading. I picked up another folder. This one was labeled with a patient name. The name was crossed out, but not completely. The letters still showed through the ink. I opened it. The notes were standard at first. The patient's symptoms, the patient's treatment, the patient's progress. Then the notes changed. They became more personal. The handwriting shifted, becoming shakier. The words became a little desperate. It said, "I can hear the building. I can hear it breathing. It is waiting. It is hungry." I stopped reading. My hands began to shake again. I couldn't tell if the note was written by a patient or by someone else. I looked at the date. It was the same date I had seen in the other files. The same date that was connected to my name. The same date that made my stomach twist. I turned the page. The next entry was written in a different handwriting. It was neat and calm. It said, "The patient is calm. The patient is compliant. The patient is quiet." Then beneath it, in smaller letters, the same handwriting added, "The patient is mine now." I felt a wave of nausea. I closed the folder. I put it down carefully. I realized something that made my blood run cold. The files were not just reacting to being read. They were responding to me, like they were aware of my presence, like they were aware of my thoughts, like they were aware of my fear. I picked up a file at random. The cover was blank, no label, no name. I opened it. The first page was empty. The second page had a sentence written in the same dark ink. "You are here." I stared at the words. I felt like I was being watched. I felt like the building was leaning closer. I closed the file and put it down. I sat back at the table, my hands trembling. The basement was still. The air was still. But I could feel the files around me. Like they were waiting. Like they were breathing. Like they were alive. I looked at the box of files again. The one with the lid slightly raised. I realized then that the lid was not raised by chance. It was raised because the files inside wanted to be seen. They wanted to be read. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted someone to listen. And I was the only one there. I felt a strange mixture of fear and pity. Fear because I knew the building was not safe. Pity because I knew the files were trapped. Trapped in paper. Trapped in ink. Trapped in a place that refused to let them go. I reached for the folder labeled Subject 14 again. I opened it slowly. The pages inside were quiet. But I felt the air change. Like something had moved. Like something had turned its attention toward me. I read the first line. It was not a patient record. It was a message, written in neat handwriting. It said, "You are not alone." I felt a chill. I read the next line. "We are still here." I swallowed hard. I closed the folder. And I realized, with a sense of dread that felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, that the files were not just reacting to being read. They were reacting because they wanted to be read. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to keep their stories alive. And they would not stop until someone listened. Until someone stayed. Until someone became part of the record. Until someone was written into the pages. Until someone was remembered. I came to the asylum with a camera, a tripod, and a list of questions I thought I already knew the answers to. I thought I was doing something brave, something important, a documentary about a place people wanted to forget, a place where the past was supposed to be locked away, sealed, and left to rot. But I didn't realize that the past was still living inside the building. It was still moving, still watching, still arranging itself. The day room was on the second floor. The hall leading to it smelled like old paint and wet plaster. The walls were cracked, but the cracks looked like veins, like something underneath was trying to break through. When I pushed the door open, the room looked normal at first. Windows, old curtains, a few tables, a TV set with a cracked screen, a faded carpet that had once been blue, now stained with brown. And chairs. Lots of chairs. But they weren't placed in a circle like a group therapy room. They weren't lined up like a waiting area. They were all facing the wall. Not the center of the room. Not the door. The wall. Every chair. Facing the wall. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just staring. My camera felt heavy in my hands. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been playing a prank. Maybe someone had been using the room for something else. Maybe the chairs had been moved for cleaning. But the chairs were too neatly arranged. Too deliberate. Each chair was spaced evenly. Each one angled so it faced the wall exactly the same way, like they were placed by someone who wanted them to look perfect. And the wall they were facing wasn't special. It didn't have a painting. It didn't have a window. It didn't have a door. Just a plain wall. I stepped inside slowly. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The sound echoed through the room like a warning. I set my camera on the tripod and started filming. I told myself I was here for a documentary. I told myself I was here to document the truth. I told myself I was here to show the world what had been done in places like this. But my voice sounded strange in the room, too loud, too confident. The room didn't feel empty. It felt like it had been waiting. I walked around the chairs, filming each one. The wood was old, but the chairs looked cared for. The seats were clean. The legs were straight. The backs were smooth. It didn't make sense. A building like this, abandoned for years, shouldn't have furniture that looked like it had been polished recently. I stopped in front of the wall the chairs were facing. It was plain, it was cracked, it was stained. But there was something else. A faint mark. A darker patch in the paint, as if something had been pressed against the wall for a long time. I moved closer. The mark was shaped like a hand. Not a full hand, just the outline, like someone had pressed their palm against the wall and left a shadow. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched it. The paint was cold. The wall felt damp. My fingers came away slightly wet. I looked down at my hand. There was a thin line of moisture on my skin, like I had touched something that had been sweating. I pulled my hand back quickly, like I had been burned. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to calm myself. I told myself I was imagining it, that the building was old, that the moisture was just from the basement below, that the mark was just a stain. But the feeling in the room was changing. The air felt heavier. The silence felt thicker. I turned back to the chairs. They were still facing the wall. But now I noticed something else. The chairs were not perfectly lined up anymore. They had shifted slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to make me feel like the room was alive. Like the chairs had moved while I wasn't looking. I lifted my camera and filmed the chairs again slowly. My hands were shaking. I tried to focus on my breathing. I tried to remind myself that this was just an old building, a building that had been abandoned, a building that had been left to rot. But the room felt too deliberate, too purposeful, like someone had set it up for a reason. I stepped toward the door. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but my feet didn't move. It was like the room had decided I was not allowed to leave yet. I turned back to the chairs, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the chairs was slightly closer to the wall than the others. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to make it look different, as if someone had moved it, as if someone had been sitting in it. I walked closer. The seat was slightly indented, like someone had been sitting there recently, like someone had been sitting there and then stood up. I felt a cold wave pass through me. I looked around the room again. The chairs were facing the wall, but I realized something else. There were no marks on the floor, no scratches, no scuffs, no signs of movement, as if the chairs had been moved without touching the floor, as if they had slid on their own. I took a step back. My camera's screen showed the room in the dim light, the chairs, the wall, the hand mark. And then, for a moment, I thought I saw something in the corner of the frame. A shadow. Not a shadow from the window. Not a shadow from the camera. A shadow that didn't belong to anything. It moved, just slightly, like something had shifted behind the chairs. I blinked. The shadow was gone. My heart was beating too fast. I tried to tell myself I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks, but the room felt like it was watching me. I moved toward the door again. This time, my hand reached for the handle. The handle was cold. Too cold. Like metal that had been left outside in winter. I turned it. The door didn't open. It didn't even budge. It was locked. But I hadn't locked it. No one had locked it. The building had locked it. I pulled harder. The door stayed shut. I looked around the room, my breath coming out in short bursts. The chairs were still facing the wall. But now I noticed something else. A small piece of paper was on the floor near the wall. It was folded. It looked like someone had dropped it. I walked to it slowly. I picked it up. It was a note, written in a shaky hand. The words were short. Just one sentence. Don't look behind you. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the paper. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I looked at the chairs again. I looked at the wall. I looked at the door. And then very slowly, I turned my head. Just a little. Just enough to see. The corner of the room. The shadow. The dark space behind the chairs. And for a moment, I thought I saw a figure. A shape. A person. But it wasn't clear. It was like a smear of darkness. Like something that didn't want to be seen. I turned back to the wall quickly. My heart was pounding. The chairs were still facing the wall. But now, I felt like the room was not just arranged. It was prepared. Prepared for someone to sit. Prepared for someone to face the wall. Prepared for someone to be quiet. Prepared for someone to be still. I looked down at the note again. Don't look behind you. I realized then that the chairs were not facing the wall because they wanted to watch something. They were facing the wall because they didn't want to see what was behind them. And I understood with a cold clarity that the room was not empty. It was full of something that had been there for a long time. Something that had been waiting. Something that had been arranging the chairs. Something that had been telling people not to look. I held the note in my hand and felt the weight of it. The building felt like it was breathing. Slow, quiet, watching. And I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that I was not the first person to be trapped in that room. And I might not be the last. The rule boards were not hard to find. They were the kind of thing that sticks in your memory because they look like they belong to a different century. Heavy wood, old brass corners, letters painted in a neat, careful hand. The kind of care that makes you feel like someone once believed in the rules. I found them in the hall leading to the old patient wings. The corridor was long and narrow, with doors on either side. The air felt stale, like it had been trapped in the building for decades. Every step I took made the floor creak, and the sound seemed too loud for such an empty place. The boards were mounted on the wall, side by side, like they were waiting to be read. I stopped in front of them and felt a strange pull, like the building was inviting me to look. I set my camera to record. I didn't want to miss anything. The first board was titled Rules for Quiet Patients. The letters were painted in black. They were faded but still clear enough to read. Under the title, there were a list of rules. Rules that sounded like they were written by someone who believed silence was a cure. Rules that sounded like they were written by someone who believed fear could fix a person. I read them slowly. Rule 1, no talking after lights out. Rule 2, no crying, no shouting, no laughing. Rule 3, any noise after midnight will be punished. Punished. The word felt heavy. I kept reading. Rule 4, punishment will be decided by staff. Rule 5, quiet patients will be rewarded. Rule 6, loud patients will be returned to their rooms. The last rule was the strangest. Rule 7, if the noise continues, the patient will be removed. Removed. The word looked simple on the board, but it felt like a warning. I kept reading because I couldn't stop myself. Below the rules, there was a small note in red paint. It was written in a different hand. It looked rushed, like someone had added it later in fear. Do not break the silence. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I turned the camera slightly to the side, trying to get a better view of the board. And that's when I saw it. A list of names. A long list of names written in black ink. Some names were crossed out. Some names were smudged. Some names had a date next to them. The dates were old. They were from the 1950s. The names were written in neat handwriting, like a clerk had taken the time to write them carefully. But the way the names were arranged made my stomach tight. They were not in any order I could understand. Not alphabetical. Not by date. It was like someone had written them as they came to mind. Like someone was keeping track of something. I moved closer. The camera's light illuminated the board, but the light didn't feel like it was bright enough. It felt like the room was swallowing the light. I read the names. One name stood out. A name that I recognized. It was the name of the woman I had seen in the old files. The one I had thought was just a story. The one I had thought was a myth. The name was written in the same hand as the rules. But the date next to it was different. It was more recent. It was from the 1970s. The name was crossed out, but the ink was fresh. Not faded. Fresh. I stared at it for a long time. My heart was beating too fast. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that someone had been here recently, that someone had come to the building and added the name. But the more I looked, the more the board felt like a record, like a ledger, like a list of people who had been punished for making noise. I turned my head slowly. I looked down the hallway. The doors were closed. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. And I realized something that made my throat tight. The silence was not empty. It was controlled. It felt like a hand pressing down on the air. I took a step back from the board. My camera continued recording, but I didn't feel like I was filming a documentary anymore. I felt like I was being watched. I felt like the building was listening. I looked at the rule board again. The rules were simple. No talking. No crying. No laughing. No noise after midnight. But the note in red paint was the part that haunted me. Do not break the silence. It made me think of the chairs in the day room. It made me think of the way they faced the wall. Like they were waiting to be quiet. Like they were waiting to be punished. I kept reading the list of names. Some of them were crossed out. Some of them were not. Some names had a line through them that looked like it had been drawn carefully, with purpose. Others had been scratched out so hard that the wood beneath the paint was exposed. The names looked like they had been erased by someone who didn't want them to exist anymore. I ran my fingers along the board, almost without thinking. The wood was rough. The paint was chipped. But the names were still clear, like the ink had been pressed into the wood with a heavy hand. I pulled my hand away quickly. I didn't want to leave my fingerprints. I didn't want to leave anything behind. But it was too late. The room already knew I had been there. I turned my camera off for a moment. I needed to think. I needed to breathe. I needed to remind myself that I was not a patient. I was not a part of this place. I was a filmmaker. I was a visitor. I was someone who had come to document the truth. But the truth was changing. The truth was becoming something else. I turned the camera back on and aimed it at the board again. I read the rules one more time. I read them like I was trying to memorize them, like I was trying to protect myself, like I was trying to understand the way the building worked. I whispered the rules to myself quietly. No talking after lights out. No crying. No shouting. No laughing. Any noise after midnight will be punished. I looked down the hallway again. The silence felt heavier. I felt a faint sound. A breath. Not mine. A breath that came from somewhere down the hall. I froze. I listened. The breath was slow. It was steady. It sounded like someone sleeping. But there was no one there. The sound came again. A soft inhale. A soft exhale. I felt my body go cold. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the building. But I couldn't. The rules were in my head now. The rules were written on the board. And the list of names was staring back at me like a warning. I turned to the board one last time. I looked at the note in red paint. Do not break the silence. And I understood something that made my blood run cold. The silence was not just a rule. It was a punishment. And the building was still enforcing it. I turned my camera off and stood very still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I didn't make any sound. Because I knew in that moment that if the building heard me, it would not forgive me. It would not let me leave. And the names on the board would only keep growing. Midnight is the hour when buildings stop pretending they are empty. That night I had been sitting in the day room, staring at the chairs facing the wall, trying to make sense of the rules on the board. The air had a heavy stillness, like the building was holding its breath. My camera was off, my flashlight dimmed, and I was listening. I kept waiting for something to happen. Not because I wanted it to. Because I felt like the place was waiting for me. The clock in my pocket was ticking loudly, each second sounding like a small knock. I didn't look at it too often. It felt like the more I watched time, the more time watched me back. At 11:50, I started to feel a shift. The silence wasn't just empty anymore. It was arranged. It was like someone had set the air in a pattern. Like the building had a rhythm, and I was slowly being pulled into it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was simply the absence of sound, that the building was only old and quiet, like any abandoned place. But I had already seen the rule board. I had already seen the list of names. And the note in red paint. Do not break the silence. The closer it got to midnight, the more I felt like the building was listening for something. Not listening for noise. Listening for me. The old fluorescent lights in the ceiling flickered once, like a tired eye blinking. Then they went steady again. I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Old buildings make noises. They settle, they shift, they breathe in their own way. But this sound was different. It was soft, like someone clearing their throat, like a person trying not to be heard. I turned my head slowly, listening. The sound came again. A small, almost polite exhale. And then something else. A sound I couldn't explain. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a breath. It was the sense of being watched. It was the feeling that something was sitting behind me, not touching me, but close enough to make the air feel heavier. My skin prickled. My heart started to beat harder. I told myself to stand up, to leave, to walk out of the building and never come back. But my body didn't move. I was frozen by the feeling of being observed. At 11:58, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The chairs facing the wall were not just facing the wall. They were positioned like they were waiting, like they were arranged for an audience. I could almost picture the room as it once was. A place where people sat, quiet and still. A place where someone watched them. A place where silence was enforced like a rule of nature. The clock in my pocket ticked again. 11:59. I could feel my breath in my chest. The air felt tight. My throat felt dry. I could taste metal, like the taste you get when you're scared, and your body tries to keep you alive by preparing for something. The minute hand moved. Midnight. The room changed. Not with a sound, not with a flash, but with a shift in the way the air felt. The silence suddenly became present, like it had weight, like it had a shape, like it was standing in the room with me. I felt it first as a pressure behind my eyes, like the building was pushing the darkness into my head. Then I felt it as a sound, a soft sound, the sound of waiting. It was like the room had finally decided to speak. Not with words, with attention. I sat very still, because moving felt like it would break something. The sound of waiting grew. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clearly audible. It was a sensation, a low, constant awareness. It felt like a crowd, but not a crowd of people. A crowd of things. Things that had been kept quiet for a long time. Things that had been forced to listen. Things that had been made to wait. The sense of an audience was overwhelming. I realized, in a way that made my stomach drop, that I was not alone. I was in a room full of presence. I could feel them around me, behind me, in the corners, in the spaces between the chairs. I tried to focus on the floor, on the wood, on the dust, anything to anchor myself. But the room kept pulling my attention back to the air, to the waiting. I could almost imagine faces. Not clear faces, just the idea of faces. The impression of eyes behind a thin curtain. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. Because I knew, if I looked, I would be confirming something. And confirmation felt like a trap. I thought about the rule board, the list of names, the crossed out ones, the ones that were still there, the ones that had been erased. I thought about the note in red paint. Do not break the silence. I thought about how the building had enforced silence, how it had punished noise, how it had made the patients quiet. I thought about how the room was now quiet again, but not empty. Waiting. The waiting had a rhythm, a slow, steady beat. It matched my heart. It matched my breath. It matched the tick of the clock. It was like the room was syncing with me, like it was making me part of its silence. My hands were shaking. I tried to hold my camera steady, but my fingers trembled. I looked at the screen for a moment. The camera was recording. The red dot was glowing. I had not turned it on. It had turned itself on. I felt a cold wave of fear. The camera was on, but I didn't remember turning it on. I stared at the screen, waiting for something to show. But the screen only showed the room. Only the chairs. Only the wall. Only the darkness. The waiting sound grew stronger. And then I heard something else. A small sound, coming from the direction of the chairs. A quiet scrape, like a chair moving. Slowly, carefully, as if someone was adjusting their position. I held my breath. I didn't want to breathe too loudly. I didn't want to make any sound at all. But the sound of the chair continued. It moved again. A little closer. A little closer. I felt a wave of panic. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the room and never look back. But my body was locked in place. It felt like the room had put a hand on my shoulders, like it was holding me still. The chair moved again, and then I realized something. The chairs weren't just facing the wall. They were facing me. They were arranged in a way that made me the center of attention. The room wasn't waiting for something to happen. The room was waiting for me to react. The waiting sound grew louder, not in volume but in intensity. It pressed into my mind. It made my thoughts feel crowded. I tried to think of something else. Anything else. I tried to think of my home, of sunlight, of the smell of coffee, of the sound of traffic outside. But the room wouldn't let me. The room wanted me to stay. The room wanted me to be quiet. The room wanted me to listen. The chair moved again. This time I saw it. A small shift in the darkness. The edge of a chair leg. A shadow sliding across the floor. Not because someone was moving the chair, but because the darkness itself was moving. It felt like the room was breathing. Like the shadows were alive. Like the waiting was not a feeling anymore. It was a presence. I whispered without meaning to. I'm not supposed to be here. The words felt like a mistake. They broke the silence in the smallest way possible. The waiting sound stopped. Immediately, the room went completely still. I could hear my own breath, my own heartbeat, my own thoughts. The silence was now empty again. And I realized the terrible thing. The room was not silent because it had no sound. It was silent because it had chosen to be quiet. And when I spoke, it had stopped listening. The waiting was gone. The room had lost interest. I sat there for a long time, breathing slowly, trying to calm my body, trying to convince myself it was over. But I knew it was. The moment I spoke, the room changed. It became aware of me. It had noticed my voice. It had reacted. And I understood something that made my skin crawl. The room wasn't waiting for me to leave. It was waiting for me to speak again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I didn't do anything that could be considered noise. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own fear. Because I knew the building was listening too. And it was patient. It was waiting. I didn't expect to see anyone that night. I had come to the building with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. I had come to document the strange arrangements, the chairs, the rules, the silence. I had not come to find company. But the hospital was not empty. That was the first thing I understood as soon as I stepped back into the day room. The chairs were still facing the wall. But they weren't alone. There were bodies in the room. Not people in the sense that I could recognize them. Not alive, at least not in the way I understood life. But the shapes were there. The presence was there. The way a room feels different when it is full of people, even if you can't see their faces. I froze at the doorway. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else. Something like wet cloth, like old medicine, like a scent that never quite leaves a place once it has been used. The chairs were not empty. They were occupied. The bodies sat perfectly still. Their heads were bowed. Their hands rested in their laps. They looked like they were waiting for something. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that my eyes were playing tricks, that my mind was filling the room with memories of the rules I had read, that I was seeing what I expected to see. But the room did not feel like a trick. It felt real, and it felt watched. The patients were not looking at me. They were looking at the wall. Or maybe they were looking through it. Or beyond it. It was hard to tell. Their stillness was not peaceful. It was tense, like they were holding themselves in place, like they were trying not to move too much too quickly, like they were afraid of what might happen if they did. I took one step into the room. The floorboards creaked softly. The sound was like a crack in a glass. One of the figures shifted slightly. It was a tiny movement, just a small turn of the head, but it felt like a reaction. Like the room had noticed me. I stopped. My breath became shallow. I tried to speak, to say something polite, to announce myself, but my voice didn't come out. It was swallowed by the air, by the heavy silence. The figures remained still. Their faces were hidden in shadow. I could not tell if they were old or young, sick or healthy, dead or alive. All I could tell was that they were there. And they were waiting. I tried to move closer slowly, without making a sound. The closer I got, the more I noticed. The room was arranged like a waiting room. Like a place where people came to be seen. The chairs were lined up neatly, in rows. The way you would arrange chairs for a crowd. But the crowd was silent. The silence felt like a rule. Like something enforced. Like something that had been taught. I remembered the rule board. No talking after dark. No loud noises. Quiet patience only. The words were not just instructions. They were a promise. Or a threat. I realized then, with a chill that spread through my body, that the patients were not waiting for a nurse. They were waiting for someone else. A visitor. A person to come and sit with them. A person to stay. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. The idea was simple, but it made my stomach turn. Visiting hours. A time when families came to see their loved ones. A time when the patients could speak. A time when they could be reminded they were still human. But this place did not have visiting hours. Not in the normal sense. The hospital had stopped being a hospital a long time ago. It had become a waiting room. And the visitors were expected to stay. I took another step. The air grew colder. The room seemed to breathe in response. The figures shifted again. This time, more than just a head turn. One of them lifted its hand. Slowly, carefully, as if testing the air. The hand hovered in the space between the chairs. Then it lowered again. It did not reach for me. It did not ask for help. It did not beg. It simply moved, like a person adjusting to their seat. I felt a wave of sadness then. A strange, deep sadness. Not my sadness. Their sadness. The sadness of waiting. Of being left. Of being forgotten. I thought about the patients I had read about in the records. The ones whose names were crossed out. The ones who vanished. The ones who were erased mid-sentence. Maybe they were not gone. Maybe they were still here. Still waiting. Still expecting someone to arrive. Someone to stay. My camera was in my hand. The red recording light was on. It had turned itself on again. I hadn't touched it. I felt my skin go cold. I looked down at the screen. The camera was showing the room. The chairs. The figures. But it was also showing something else. A small detail I hadn't noticed with my own eyes. A door at the back of the room. A door I hadn't seen before. It was partially open. A sliver of darkness beyond it. And in that darkness, there was a faint glow. Like a candle. Like a light left on for someone who might come. My breath caught. I looked at the figures again. They were still sitting. Still waiting. Still watching the wall. As if the wall was the only door. As if the wall was the only way in. I felt the urge to leave. To run. To go back to the lobby, to the exit, to the world outside. But something held me. A curiosity. A sense that if I left, I would be leaving them alone. leaving them to wait. I took a step toward the door. The figures shifted again. The sound was barely there, but it was there. A soft scrape. A whisper of movement. The room seemed to lean toward the door, like the air itself was drawn to it. I reached the door. My hand touched the handle. It was cold. Too cold. Like a metal that had been in the dark for a long time. I turned it slowly. The door opened with a soft creak. The darkness beyond was thick. The glow was still there, faint and steady. I stepped through. The air changed immediately. It felt different, like a different room entirely. The glow came from a small window, a narrow slit in the wall. Outside, I could see a faint light. Not from the building, from somewhere else. A distant street lamp. A car passing. The world outside. The world where people lived. The world where visitors came and left. The room behind me was still. The figures were still. The chairs were still. But the sense of waiting was gone. It was replaced by something else. A feeling of relief. Like the building had been holding its breath for a long time. And now it had let go. I turned back toward the day room. The door was still open. The chairs still faced the wall. The figures still sat. But now the wall looked different. It looked like a boundary. A line between two worlds. I understood then. The patients were not waiting for a nurse. They were waiting for a visitor. Someone to sit with them. Someone to stay. And once you entered the room, you became part of the waiting. The hospital did not announce visiting hours, because it did not need to. The visitors were expected to stay. I've always been drawn to places that don't want to be found. Not because I'm brave, not because I'm curious in the way people mean it when they say they're curious. I don't want to know what's behind the locked doors of abandoned buildings because I think it will be exciting. I go because I can feel the silence pulling at me. It's the same feeling you get when you stand at the edge of a quiet lake at night. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound loud. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for you to make a mistake. That's why I was there. The old psychiatric hospital on the edge of town had been shut down for years. The therapy wing was still standing, even though the rest of the complex was falling apart. The locals called it the White House because of the pale paint and the tall windows that looked like blank eyes. My friends and I had explored a few places before. Old factories, abandoned schools, empty warehouses, but this was different. The hospital had a history. It had stories. And stories, I've learned, are just a polite way of saying something happened there that people don't want to talk about. We arrived just before dusk when the light was fading but not gone. The sky was the color of ash. The air smelled like wet leaves and old stone. The hospital stood in the distance, half hidden by trees. The therapy wing was the newest part, built later than the rest, with smoother walls and a more modern shape. It looked like it didn't belong. We slipped through a gap in the fence and moved carefully, the way you move when you don't want to be seen. The grass was tall and wet. It clung to our shoes. Every step made a soft squelch. Inside, the building was colder than the air outside. The hallways were wide and the ceilings were high. The walls were painted a faded beige and the floor tiles were cracked in places. Old posters still clung to the walls, curled and yellowed. Some of them had slogans about mental health, about community care, about healing. It all felt wrong. Not because of the decay, but because of the silence. The silence in an abandoned building isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of something else. It's the feeling that the building is still listening. We moved through the therapy wing slowly, our flashlights cutting thin lines through the darkness. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between us, like we were all holding our breath at the same time. There were rooms with chairs still arranged in circles. There were rooms with old, rusted equipment. There were rooms with shelves of paper records that had been left behind, like someone had just walked out and never returned. And then we found the stairwell. It wasn't on the main map we'd found online. It wasn't mentioned in any of the old photos or videos we'd watched. It was tucked away behind a narrow hallway, hidden behind a door that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The door was painted the same beige as the walls. It was so plain that it almost looked like it was meant to blend in. There was no handle. At first, I thought it was just broken, or removed, or maybe the door was meant to be opened from the other side. But the door didn't have any sign of a handle at all. No indentation, no holes, no lock, just a smooth surface that looked like it had been sealed shut. My friend Javed ran his hand along the edge, his fingers tracing the seam. "This is weird," he whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. It's like it was never meant to be opened. We stood there for a moment, staring at the door. The air in the hallway felt heavier. It felt denser, like the building was pressing in on us. Then Rita, who was always the brave one, said, "Maybe it's just a storage closet." I didn't like the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself more than us. But she was right in a way. The door didn't look like a secret passage. It looked like a simple door that had been sealed for a reason. We found a small gap at the bottom. It was narrow, but not completely closed. The floor beneath the door was warped and cracked. The gap was dark, but there was something else inside it. A thin line of dust. It looked like someone had been moving through the space under the door recently. My heart started to beat faster. I don't know why. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I just felt aware, like my body was trying to protect me before my mind had a chance to understand what was happening. Javed crouched down and shone his flashlight into the gap. The light barely reached, but he saw something. He looked up at us slowly, his face pale. "There's a stairway," he whispered. "Down there I can see steps." We all leaned in closer. It was impossible. The door was on the ground floor. There shouldn't be a stairway behind it. The floor was solid. The building was old, but not that old. And yet there was a staircase. It went down into darkness. Rita looked at the door again, then back at us. "We should check it out," she said quietly. I wanted to say no. I wanted to turn around and walk out like we hadn't seen anything. But the moment she said it, I felt the pull again. The silence was calling. I agreed without thinking. We moved back down the hallway to the maintenance room where we'd found a crowbar earlier. We carried it back to the door, careful not to make too much noise. The air felt thick, like we were walking through water. The crowbar slid under the edge of the door. I braced myself. Javed put his weight into it, and the metal bent slightly. The door didn't budge. We tried again, harder. The door resisted like it was holding onto something. Then with a soft groan, the door shifted. It didn't swing open like a normal door. It slid inward, as if the wall itself was swallowing it. The sound was quiet, but it felt loud in the silence. We stood there staring into the gap. The stairway below was dark, but not pitch black. There was a faint, sickly glow coming from somewhere deeper. It wasn't light from outside. It wasn't a flashlight. It was something else. I felt a cold wave wash over me. I don't know why I felt cold. The air wasn't colder. The darkness wasn't colder. It was like the building had exhaled and the breath had reached me. Rita was the first to step forward. I watched her descend the stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. Javed followed. I stayed behind for a moment, my hand still on the edge of the door. I didn't want to go down, but I couldn't stop myself. I took the first step. The stairwell was narrow and tight, and the walls were damp. The smell was strange. Not mold exactly, more like old medicine, like the kind of scent you remember from hospitals, but thicker, older. As we descended, the glow grew stronger. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was the kind of light that made everything look slightly wrong. The stairs ended at a landing, and at the landing was another door. This one had a handle, but the handle was covered in rust, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. The door itself was heavy, made of thick metal. There was a small window at the top, but it was covered in grime. We couldn't see through it. Rita put her hand on the handle and hesitated. I felt a sudden, sharp thought in my head, like someone else was thinking it for me. Don't open it. But the thought didn't feel like mine. It felt like the building. Jade whispered, maybe we should turn back. Rita didn't answer. She just turned the handle. The door opened with a slow, reluctant creak. The sound echoed down the stairwell, and for a moment I thought I heard something else. Not a sound, a movement, like something shifting in the darkness beyond the door. We stepped inside. The room was small. It was lined with shelves. There were boxes stacked on the floor. There were old files. There was a smell of paper and dust. But there was something else too. Something that didn't belong. A faint rhythmic sound, like a slow tapping. We stood still, listening. The tapping continued, steady and patient. Then from somewhere deeper in the room, a whisper came. Not a voice, not words, just a sound like someone breathing. My skin went cold. Rita took a step forward. The tapping stopped. We all froze. Then, after a long moment, the tapping started again. But now it sounded different, like it was coming from somewhere closer. We turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, in the corner, there was a door. Not a normal door, not like the ones we'd seen upstairs. This door was sealed shut. No handle, no lock, just a smooth surface the same color as the wall. But there was a seam around it, like it had been placed there intentionally. And at the center of the door, faintly visible in the dim glow, there was a mark. A handprint. Not a fresh one, not a dirty one. A handprint that looked like it had been pressed there from the inside. As if someone had tried to get out. As if someone had been trapped. I felt my heart hammer in my chest. I wanted to run, but I didn't. Because the door didn't just look like a door. It looked like an answer. And something in me wanted to know what was behind it. The air in that room was wrong in a way I still can't describe. It wasn't just the smell, or the darkness, or the way the light seemed to flicker even though we didn't move the flashlight. It was something else, something that felt like the building itself was watching us. I remember the moment I realized we weren't alone. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, like the hairs on my arms were standing up because something had walked past me just out of sight. I don't know if it was my imagination. Maybe it was. Maybe it was the kind of fear that makes your brain invent things to justify itself. But when you're standing in a sealed room in an abandoned hospital, your brain has plenty of reasons to invent things. The door with no handle stood at the far end of the room like a closed mouth. The handprint on it looked older now, like it had dried and faded over time. The mark had the shape of a palm and fingers, but it wasn't sharp. It was soft around the edges, like the hand that pressed it was not made of skin. I took a step closer. The tapping sound started again. This time, it didn't sound like a person tapping on wood. It sounded like something tapping from inside the wall. The sound was slow, patient, like someone trying to get attention without making too much noise. Rita whispered, "Do you hear that?" Jave didn't answer. He was staring at the floor. I followed his gaze. The concrete floor was scratched, deep scratches as if someone had dragged something heavy across it. Not a chair, not a cart, something that scraped and tore at the surface. There were marks all over the floor, but the most disturbing ones were near the door. They looked like lines, like someone had tried to drag a body, or someone had been pulled along the floor. The scratches were old but not ancient. The concrete had not fully healed. It was like the marks were still fresh in the building's memory. I crouched down and ran my fingers over one of the scratches. It felt like the concrete had been etched, like someone had carved into it with a sharp object. There was something else too. Small circular indentations, tiny holes in the concrete, like the floor had been pierced with something thin and sharp. I looked closer. The holes were arranged in a pattern, like something had been tied down. My stomach turned. I stood up slowly, trying not to breathe too loudly. "Restraints," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Rita's flashlight trembled in her hand, like chains. I nodded. The idea of someone being tied down in that room made my skin crawl. The room was too small, too cramped, too quiet, and the thought of someone being held there, unheard for who knows how long, made the silence feel heavier. I tried to imagine it. A patient or a person who wasn't even a patient being brought down here, being forced into a corner, being tied down with something sharp, something that left marks in the concrete, and then being left. The thought made my mouth go dry. Jave stepped closer to the door, and I felt my heart jump. He was looking at the handprint, but his eyes were not focused on the shape. They were focused on something else. "Look," he said quietly. I leaned closer. There were faint marks around the handprint, like scratches, like someone had been trying to pull their hand away, or like someone had been trying to push through. The scratches around the handprint were deeper, more desperate. They looked like they had been made by nails. It was a horrible thought. The kind of thought you don't want to have because once it exists in your mind, you can't unthink it. I felt the urge to step back, to leave the room, to never speak of it again. But my body didn't move. It was as if the building had a hold on me. I looked at the pattern of holes in the floor again. There were 5 sets, each arranged in a square, like something had been tied down at 5 points. The marks were too neat to be random. It wasn't a struggle, it was an arrangement. And the arrangement suggested planning. Someone had planned to keep someone here. Someone had planned to keep them quiet. And the worst part was that the room was so isolated. No windows, no sound, no way to be heard. I tried to imagine how long someone could survive like that. How long someone could be left alone in a room with no one hearing them. The tapping sound continued, slow and steady. It was coming from behind the sealed door. The handprint looked like a reminder, like a message, like someone had wanted to leave a sign, even if they couldn't speak. Rita's voice broke the silence again. "We should go." It sounded like she was talking to herself, like she was trying to convince herself that leaving was an option. Jave shook his head. "We can't just leave, not now." His words were calm, but his eyes were wide. He looked like someone who had just seen something that made the world feel less safe. I swallowed hard. "I don't want to be here," I said. It wasn't a question, it was a confession. But I stayed. I stayed because I couldn't stop. The tapping grew louder. It wasn't a simple sound anymore. It sounded like something was moving behind the door, something trying to get closer. I stepped toward the door again. The air around it felt colder. The light from our flashlights seemed to fade as we approached. It wasn't dark, but it was dimmer, like the room didn't want us to see. I pressed my hand against the door. The surface was cold, but not like metal. Cold like stone. Cold like a buried place. The handprint felt rough under my fingertips, as if the material had been textured. I felt a strange sensation, like a pressure building behind the door. A feeling like someone was pressing their hand against the other side, pushing. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart racing. Rita stepped closer to me. "Do you feel that?" I nodded, unable to speak. Jave reached out and placed his hand on the door too. He didn't move his hand. He just stood there staring. I could tell he was thinking something. I could tell he was trying to convince himself that the door was just a door, that the handprint was just a mark, that the scratches in the floor were just old damage. But the look in his eyes told me he knew better. The tapping stopped. The silence returned. And in that silence, I heard something else. A faint sound, like a whisper carried through the concrete. Not words, just a breath. Like someone exhaling. I felt a sudden wave of nausea. I stepped back, my legs feeling weak. The room felt smaller, the walls felt closer, the air felt thick. Rita whispered, "We should leave now." But as she spoke, the handprint on the door seemed to change. Not in a visible way, not like it moved or anything. It just felt different. Like the pressure behind it had shifted. Like something had leaned against it. Like something was waiting. I don't know how long we stood there. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. But eventually, we turned away. We walked back toward the stairwell. The stairs felt longer on the way up. The air felt heavier. The building felt like it was holding its breath. When we reached the top, we didn't speak. We didn't look at each other. We just moved, each step echoing through the empty hallway. And as we walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the marks on the concrete. The scratches, the holes, the handprint, the idea that someone had been kept down there, in a room no one heard, in a place that didn't even have a handle. The thought kept returning, like a cold wave that wouldn't stop. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. If someone had been kept there, if someone had been restrained, then the handprint wasn't just a mark. It was a warning, a sign that someone had tried to escape and failed. The thing about old buildings is that they keep things, not just dust or memories or the smell of old paint. They keep sounds. You can stand in a hallway that's been empty for decades, and if you listen long enough, you can hear the echo of what used to happen there. Not in the sense of a ghost story, but in a more physical way, like the building remembers the pressure of voices. The therapy wing had that kind of memory. After we left the basement room with the sealed door, we didn't go back. Not that night, not right away. We went outside and stood in the cold air, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince ourselves that the world was still the world. But the building was still inside us. It felt like the hospital had followed us out. When we finally left, it was late. The sky was almost black. The trees looked like dark fingers. The streetlights were few and far between, and their light made the shadows look even deeper. We didn't talk much on the walk back to our cars. We didn't need to. The silence was heavy enough. But the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the room. The scratches on the concrete, the handprint, the feeling that someone had been down there waiting. I tried to push it away. I tried to tell myself that it was just an old building, that the marks could be from anything, that the handprint was just a stain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. I went back to the hospital later that week, alone. I told myself it was because I wanted to record the place. I wanted to document it. I wanted to understand it. The truth was simpler. I needed to know if what I'd felt was real. I entered the therapy wing the same way we had before, through the broken fence and the wet grass. The building was quieter during the day. The air felt less heavy, but the silence was still there. I walked through the hallways slowly, my flashlight beam steady. I passed the rooms with the old chairs. I passed the rooms with the rusted equipment. I passed the shelves of records. Everything looked the same, but the air felt different. It felt like I was being watched. I found the stairwell again. The door with no handle was still there, sealed into the wall like a secret the building didn't want to admit. I placed my hand on the door. The surface was cold, and the handprint felt faint, like a memory. I felt the pressure again, like something was pushing from the other side. My stomach tightened. I moved the crowbar under the door again and pushed. The door slid inward, and I descended the stairs. The glow was there again, faint and sickly. When I reached the bottom, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the stairwell, there was a small, old recorder on the floor. It looked like it had been dropped. The kind of recorder people used before everything was digital. It was dusty and worn, but it was still intact. My heart started to beat faster. I picked it up carefully. It was heavier than I expected. It felt like it had weight because it had been holding something for a long time. There was a button on it, a red one. It was worn down like it had been pressed many times. I pressed it. The recorder clicked. And then faintly, a voice came through. Not loud, not clear, but there was a voice. It sounded like a woman, calm, patient, the kind of voice you would hear in a therapy session. "Hello," the voice said. "Can you tell me your name?" The sound was crackling, like the tape had been sitting for years, but the voice was there. I froze. My hand went cold around the recorder. I pressed the button again to rewind. The tape clicked and rewound slowly, the way old tapes do. When it stopped, the voice began again. "Hello," the woman said. "Can you tell me your name?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. I pressed the button again to stop it. My mind was racing. This wasn't just a recording. This was a session. Someone had been recorded here. Someone had been talking. I looked around the room, trying to find where the sound was coming from. The shelves, the boxes, the sealed door. I walked closer to the sealed door. The handprint looked darker now, like it had been pressed more recently. I put the recorder on the floor and pressed play again, letting the voice continue. "Tell me what you see," the woman said. There was a pause. Then a low voice, muffled, as if it was coming from far away. "I see a door," the voice said. "I see a door without a handle." My blood ran cold. I looked at the door. The voice continued, almost whispering. "Can you tell me what you feel?" The low voice replied, trembling. "I feel like I'm trapped," it said. "I feel like someone is watching me." The woman's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Tell me more," she said. "Tell me about the room." The low voice paused again. "I'm in a small room," it said. "There's a door. There are marks on the floor. There are holes. I'm tied down." My hands shook. I didn't know whether to be angry or scared or sick. The voice continued. "Do you remember why you're here?" the woman asked. The low voice responded, and it sounded like it was trying not to cry. "I don't remember," it said. "I just remember they come and they talk to me. They ask me questions. They say I'm improving. They say I'm healing. But I don't know if I am." The tape crackled. I pressed pause again. I stood there in the dim light, holding the recorder, listening to the silence. The idea that someone had been kept here, and that they had been recorded, was unbearable. I pressed play again. The woman's voice was still calm. "Are you feeling any pain?" she asked. The low voice answered, "No." "Are you feeling safe?" she asked. There was a pause. "No," the voice said. The woman's voice didn't change. "Why not?" she asked. The low voice whispered, "Because no one can hear me." The silence after that was thick. I pressed stop. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the recorder. I sat down on the floor, back against the wall. I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The session was ongoing. The therapist was asking questions. The patient was responding, but the patient was trapped. The patient was alone, and the patient was speaking to a voice that was not there. Or maybe the voice was there. Maybe the voice belonged to someone who was still in the building. Maybe the voice belonged to someone who had never left. I didn't want to think about that. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I kept listening. The tape started again, and the woman's voice returned. "Do you remember your family?" she asked. The patient's voice was faint. "I remember a face, but I can't see it clearly." The woman's voice stayed calm. "What does it feel like when you try to remember?" The patient's voice shook. "It hurts, like my head is being pulled." The tape crackled. "Good," the woman said. "That means we're making progress." Progress? The word sounded wrong in that room, like it didn't belong. Like someone was using it to hide something. The patient continued, voice trembling. "I can hear them outside," the patient said. "They're walking, they're talking, but they don't come in." The woman's voice stayed calm. "Tell me what they're saying," she said. The patient whispered, they're saying I'm better. They're saying I can go home." The tape crackled again, like the tape itself was struggling to hold the words. "And are you better?" the woman asked. The patient's voice was quiet, almost broken. "I don't know," the patient said. "I don't know if I'm alive." I pressed stop. My heart was pounding. I didn't know how long I sat there, listening to the silence. But I knew one thing. The therapy sessions hadn't stopped. They had just moved somewhere else. Somewhere where no one could hear. And the recordings were still here, like a trail. Like proof. Like a confession. I stood up slowly, my legs numb. I left the room, taking the recorder with me. As I climbed the stairs, the air felt colder. When I reached the top, I felt like the building was watching me leave. And I realized something that made my skin crawl. The sessions were still happening. Not because someone was recording them, but because someone was still listening. The thing that people don't understand about places like that hospital is that the building itself isn't the scary part. It's the leftover purpose. Hospitals are built to fix people, to make them better, to help them leave the room feeling lighter than when they arrived. But when a hospital is abandoned, the purpose doesn't disappear. It just waits. And it waits in a way that feels like it's breathing. When I went back to the therapy wing after the audio logs, I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the thing that had been listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building had heard something, and it hadn't finished hearing it. The next time I went, I brought a small camera and a voice recorder. I told myself I was going to document the place properly. I told myself I was going to prove that the sessions had happened, that the room had been used. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid that if I didn't go back, the memory would become a story in my head. I was afraid that the story would grow and become something worse than what was real. So I went back. It was late again. The sun had already disappeared, leaving the world in a kind of gray-blue light. The hospital looked different at night. It looked less like a building and more like a shape. I entered the therapy wing the same way. The same hallway, the same door with no handle, the same stairwell. But this time, when I opened the door, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a faint smell of something sweet, like old medicine mixed with a floral perfume. It was subtle, but it was there. It made my stomach twist. I descended the stairs. The glow was there again, the sickly light coming from deeper down. But the light seemed stronger now, like it had been waiting for me to return. When I reached the bottom, I saw something that made my breath catch. There were footprints. Not mine, not the ones from my friends. Fresh footprints. They were in the dust, and they led from the stairwell to the sealed door at the far end of the room. The footprints were small, barefoot. They looked like they belonged to someone who had been walking slowly, like they didn't want to make noise. My heart began to beat harder. I followed the footprints carefully, trying not to disturb them. The air felt heavier the closer I got to the sealed door. The smell of the sweet medicine grew stronger. The handprint was still there, but now it looked almost wet. Not wet like water, wet like something else. The footprint stopped at the door. There was no sign of anyone on the other side. No sound, no movement. But I could feel it. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stood there staring at the door, and I heard something behind me. A sound like a soft scrape. I turned quickly, flashlight raised. There was nothing. Just the shelves, just the boxes, just the dust. But the sound had come from the direction of the boxes, like something had been moved. I took a step closer, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. There was a box that had been shifted. It wasn't like the others. It was not stacked neatly. It looked like someone had moved it with their hands. I knelt down and pulled it out. Inside were old patient files. They were stacked neatly, like someone had arranged them. But the top file was different. It was newer. Not by much, but enough to stand out. It wasn't yellowed like the others. It wasn't brittle. It looked like it had been handled recently. I opened it. The paper inside was filled with writing, not typed, handwritten. The handwriting was neat, like a doctor's notes. But the words were strange. They were written like a conversation. Like someone had been writing down what someone else was saying. The first line read, "Patient refuses to respond, but therapy continues." I read further. Session continues. Patient remains silent, therapist speaks. Patient shows signs of awareness. Patient hears voices. Patient believes the door is a doorway. Patient believes someone is on the other side. My hands shook. I kept reading. The notes went on for pages. The same pattern, the therapist asking questions, the patient not answering, the therapist continuing anyway. Like the therapist had been speaking to an empty room. Like the therapist had been trying to fill a silence that wouldn't go away. I flipped through the file, and the handwriting became more frantic. Patient begins to scream silently. Patient begins to claw at the walls. Patient attempts to escape. Restraints prevent escape. Patient begins to talk to someone behind the door. I stopped reading. My stomach felt sick. I put the file back in the box and stood up. The room felt like it was closing in. I could feel the building pressing on me again. The tapping started. Slow, patient. It was coming from behind the sealed door. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't just tapping. It was tapping in a pattern. Like a code. Like someone was trying to communicate. I pressed my ear to the door. The tapping was faint, but I could hear it clearly. It was a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Pause. It repeated. It sounded like someone counting, or someone trying to remember something. My mind raced. The notes had said the patient had been talking to someone behind the door. But what if the patient was the one behind the door? What if the patient had been locked inside? What if the therapist had been on the other side? The thought made my skin crawl. I took a step back. The footprints were still there. Fresh, barefoot. They looked like they had been made by someone who had walked out of the room and left again. But where had they gone? The tapping continued. I turned and walked toward the stairwell, my heart pounding. As I climbed the stairs, the tapping faded, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. When I reached the top, I felt the air change. It felt like the building was breathing again. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. I looked around and I realized something. The therapy wing wasn't empty. I could hear voices. Not loud, not clear. Just voices. They sounded like they were coming from somewhere deep inside the building. Like a distant radio playing in another room. I stood still, listening. The voices were too faint to understand. But they were there, and they were repeating, like a loop, like a session that never ended. I turned and walked away. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to hear the voices. But as I left, I felt something brush against my mind. A thought, a single sentence, clear as if someone had spoken it directly into my ear. You should come back. I froze. The words weren't my own. They weren't my fear. They weren't my imagination. They felt like someone else was thinking through me. I didn't stay to argue with it. I left the hospital and drove home with the windows rolled up, the radio off, and my hands tight on the steering wheel. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tapping. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Pause. I kept thinking about the footprints. The fresh footprints. The patient files. The therapy notes. The voices. And the sentence that had been planted in my mind. You should come back. I tried to tell myself it was just the building messing with me. Just the fear. Just the imagination. But the next morning, I found something on my desk. A small piece of paper. No handwriting. No print. Just a single word, written in a dark, thin line. Return. I didn't put it there. I know I didn't. And I still don't know who did. But I know one thing. Something in that hospital is still waiting for treatment. And it's not finished. Not to the asylum, not to the place that had taken years from me and then pretended it had never happened. I didn't even want to say the name out loud. The way people say it now, like it's just a building, like it's just an old hospital with broken windows. But it was. It was a place that kept people. And it was a place that taught me to forget. I was declared cured. That's what they wrote on my file. That's what they told my family. That's what I told myself every time I tried to sleep without waking up in a cold sweat. Cured. The word was like a clean cut, like a neat ending. But it was, because even after they released me, I still heard the voices. Not real voices, not the kind you can point at, more like the echo of questions that never ended. The first time I went back, it was because of a letter. It came one morning, folded into a thin envelope with no return address. The paper felt cheap, like something you'd buy at a corner store, but the writing was careful, like someone had taken their time. It said, "We have your file. Please come back to sign the final papers." I laughed when I read it. I remember that. I laughed like it was a joke, like the hospital had finally realized they had made a mistake. But the laugh died in my throat, because the letter didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a request. It sounded like an order. I tried to throw it away. I tried to burn it. I tried to ignore it. But the letter stayed in my mind, like a word that wouldn't leave my mouth. I went to work that day, and everything felt wrong. The office was bright. The air smelled like coffee, and the normal sounds of people typing felt like noise I couldn't handle. I kept thinking about the letter. I kept thinking about the word final. What final papers? What final signature? I didn't want to go back, but the letter was there, and the letter had a way of making the world feel smaller. Like the asylum had reached into my life and pulled me back. That night I drove there. The road was quiet. The trees looked like they were leaning in. The sky was dark and the streetlights flickered as if they were tired. When I saw the building, my stomach dropped. It looked the same as it always had. The same pale walls, the same tall windows, the same long driveway leading to the main entrance. But it also looked different. It looked waiting, like it had been expecting me. I parked my car a little distance away and stood there for a moment, staring at the asylum. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to go in. But I did. The front doors were unlocked. I didn't expect that. I thought maybe the place was still abandoned. I thought maybe it was just an old building now, empty and silent. But the doors opened easily, like they had been waiting for someone to push them. The lobby was dark. The air was cold. The smell of old cleaning chemicals mixed with dust made my throat tighten. There were old chairs lined up along the walls. A reception desk sat empty, like it had been waiting for someone to sit behind it. And on the desk was a folder. A single folder, with my name on it. My heart started to pound. I walked toward it slowly, like I was approaching a dangerous animal. The folder was thick. It felt heavy in my hands, like it had weight because of the secrets inside. I opened it. The first page was a copy of my discharge papers. The words were the same as the ones I'd seen years ago. Patient released, condition stable. No further treatment required. Patient cleared. Then there was a second page. A page I had never seen before. It was a document titled, Final Treatment Agreement. My hands went cold. I read the first line. By signing this document, the patient agrees to continue therapy after release, even if the patient does not remember participating. I read it again. I read it a third time. My vision blurred. I couldn't understand what it meant. I kept reading. The patient agrees to return for periodic sessions, as requested by the facility. The patient agrees that the facility may continue treatment in any location deemed necessary. The patient agrees that the facility may not be required to obtain consent if the patient is deemed unable to respond. I dropped the folder. It hit the desk with a soft thud that sounded too loud in the quiet lobby. I stepped back, my breath coming in short bursts. This was not a release. This was a contract. A contract I had never signed. But the words looked like they had been written by someone who knew me, someone who had been inside my head. I felt a strange sensation, like my skin was tightening. I looked around the lobby. The silence felt heavy, like the building was listening. I didn't know how long I stood there, maybe a minute, maybe 10. Time felt strange, like it didn't want to move. Then I heard a sound, a soft click, like a door being closed. I turned. The hallway beyond the lobby was dark, but I could see a faint light at the end, like a room that was still in use. A door was opening, and I realized with a sudden cold clarity that I was not alone. Someone was in the building. Someone was waiting. I took a step forward, and my mind flashed with memories I hadn't thought about in years. The way the nurses used to move through the halls, the way the therapists used to speak softly, as if they were afraid of being overheard, the way the patients would stare at the walls like they were listening to something no one else could hear. I had thought it was just the hospital, but now standing there, I realized something else. The hospital wasn't the only thing that was listening. I was too. I had been listening for years, and the hospital had been speaking to me. I followed the light down the hallway. The walls were lined with old photos, faces of patients, faces of staff, faces of people I didn't know. The air felt colder as I moved deeper into the building. The light led me to a room at the end of the hall. The door was open. Inside there was a desk, a chair, a lamp, and a single sheet of paper. It was placed neatly in the center of the desk, as if someone had been waiting for me to sit down. I stepped inside. The lamp was on, but the room was still dim. The light was too soft, like it was trying not to wake anyone. I approached the desk slowly. The paper on the desk was blank, but there was a pen beside it, and the pen was warm. I picked it up. My hand trembled. I didn't know why the pen was warm. It didn't make sense. The building was cold. The air was stale. But the pen felt like it had been held recently, like someone had just put it down. My mind filled with a thought so clear it felt like it had been spoken. Sign it. I stared at the blank page. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to sign anything. But the pen was in my hand, and the paper was waiting. I could feel the weight of the asylum pressing down on me. I could feel the years I had spent trying to forget. And I could feel the one thing I couldn't escape. The truth that the asylum didn't release people. It released paperwork. And paperwork was something you could always bring back. I sat down slowly. The chair creaked. The sound echoed through the room. I looked at the blank page again, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a request. This was a trap. A place where I had been brought back to sign away the one thing I thought I had. My freedom. I held the pen over the paper. My hand shook, and for a moment I thought I could hear a voice in the hallway, soft and patient. Like a therapist. Like someone who had been waiting for me. Like the building itself. Just sign, the voice seemed to say. I don't remember how long I sat there. I don't remember if I stood up and ran. All I remember is the sound of my own breathing, and the feeling that the asylum was smiling. When I left the room with the blank paper, I thought the worst part was over. I thought the asylum had simply tried to pull me back in, like a hand reaching from the past. I thought if I walked far enough, I could leave it behind again. But that's the thing about places like that. They don't just trap you in a building. They trap you in a memory. And memories don't leave. They just change shape. I wandered through the hallways, my footsteps echoing softly. The light was dim and the air felt thick, like it had been breathing for years. I kept expecting to see a nurse or a doctor or someone in a white coat. But there was no one. Until I found the photographs. They were on the wall in a long row like a gallery, old black and white pictures, some faded, some clearer than they should have been. Faces of staff members, faces of patients, faces of people who had worked there for years. I didn't pay much attention at first, just the usual history display, the kind of thing you see in old buildings, a reminder of who used to be there. Then I noticed something strange. The same faces appeared in different photographs. Not just once or twice. Many times. A man with a thin mustache standing in front of the building in a group photo from the 1950s. The same man in a photo from the 1970s, older but not by much. The same man again in a photo from the 1990s, his face the same, his expression unchanged. He looked like he had never aged. And he wasn't the only one. There was a woman in a white coat, her hair pinned back. She appeared in a photo from the 1960s, then again in the 1980s, then again in the 2000s. Each time her face was the same. Same eyes, same smile, same tired look like she had seen too much. My stomach tightened. I walked slowly down the hallway, staring at the photographs. Each one was labeled with a date and a name. The dates jumped forward by decades, but the faces didn't change. It was like the staff had been frozen in time. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the photos were mislabeled, that maybe they had been copied and placed in different years. But the more I looked, the more impossible it became. There were too many of them. The same faces, repeated over and over. As if the asylum had only a few staff members, and they had been working there for 100 years. I felt my skin go cold. I turned the corner and found another row of photos. This time they were patient photos, the kind that hospitals take for records, people staring blankly at the camera, faces that looked tired, scared, or confused. I recognized some of them, not because I knew them, but because I had seen them in my own memories. The faces of people I had talked to in group sessions, faces I had seen in the day room. Some of them were still there, in the photos, even though they had been released years ago. Some of them were not in the records I had seen before. And then I saw a photo that made my breath catch. It was a photo of me. Not a recent one, not the kind of photo you'd see on a file. A photo of me from years ago, sitting in a chair in a therapy room. My eyes were blank. My face looked tired. My mouth was slightly open, like I was trying to say something. I stared at the photo, unable to move. And then I noticed something else. Standing behind me in the photo, just out of focus, was a figure in a white coat. A doctor, but the face was the same as the man with the thin mustache from the other photos. The one who never aged. My heart pounded. I stepped back from the wall, my hands shaking. I couldn't tell if I was seeing things, but the evidence was right there. The photos were proof. The same staff members had been there for decades, or something was pretending to be them. I kept walking, my mind racing. I needed to find answers. I needed to understand what I was seeing. I found a door that led to a small room. It looked like an office. There was a desk, a chair, and a cabinet filled with folders. The room felt like it had been left in a hurry. Papers scattered. A coffee cup on the desk, half full and cold. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out a folder. It was labeled with the name of the man with the thin mustache. Dr. H. Malik. The folder was thick. I opened it. The first page was his personnel record. Date of hire, 1952. Date of termination, blank. Next page. Date of hire, 1978. Date of termination, blank. Next page. Date of hire, 1999. Date of termination, blank. It went on and on. The same name, the same face, the same signature. No end date. No retirement. No death. Just a continuous line, like the hospital was refusing to let him leave. I felt sick. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the pages. It was the same signature, written in the same hand, as if the same person had signed his own file for decades. I turned the page and found something else. A handwritten note. It was short, just a few lines. It read, "Patient does not respond. Continue sessions, do not stop." I read it again, and again. I couldn't understand how a hospital could keep someone in treatment if they weren't responding. I thought that was the point of therapy, to help someone, to stop when it was no longer needed. But the note said something different. It said to continue, to never stop. I felt a sudden strange anger. Not at the hospital, at the idea of someone using the hospital as a machine. A machine that kept people in treatment, even when they were gone, even when they didn't respond. I closed the folder and sat down at the desk. I stared at the coffee cup, the papers, the old office. It felt like I was sitting in the middle of a long, slow lie. A lie that had been going on for decades. And then I heard a sound. A soft whisper. Not a voice I could understand. Just a sound like someone speaking too quietly. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The room was empty, but the air felt different, like someone had been standing behind me. I turned slowly and saw the reflection in the window. A figure in a white coat standing behind me. But the room was empty. The figure wasn't in the room. It was only in the glass. I stared at it, my breath catching. The face was the same as the man in the photographs. The one who never aged. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. But the reflection was clear. Too clear. The figure raised a hand slowly, like it was gesturing for me to come closer. I stepped back. The reflection remained. The figure didn't disappear. I turned away from the window and walked toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the handle. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder. The silence felt heavier. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch me as I passed. The faces of the staff unchanging. The faces of the patients trapped in time. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I saw something that made me stop. A sign on the wall. A simple sign with an arrow pointing down. It read, "Therapy Wing Continued Sessions." Underneath it, in smaller letters, was another line. "For patients who cannot respond." I stared at the sign. My heart pounded. The words felt like a door closing, like a sentence being finished, like a final chapter being written. I realized with a cold certainty that the asylum didn't just keep patients. It kept the staff too, or something that wore their faces, something that had learned how to sound like a therapist, something that had learned how to keep treatment going forever. And the worst part was this: the asylum wasn't empty. Not really. It was full of people who had been declared cured, full of staff who had never aged, full of sessions that never ended. And I had just walked into the middle of it. I used to think that leaving the asylum meant leaving the asylum, that once the doors closed behind me, I was free, that I could walk into the world and the world would accept me again, like nothing had happened. But the truth is, the asylum never stopped. It didn't stop when the doctors said I was cured. It didn't stop when my family hugged me and smiled and pretended they weren't afraid of me anymore. It didn't stop when I walked out into the sunlight. The asylum followed me. And the more I tried to forget, the louder it became. That's what I realized in the hallway with the photographs. That's what I realized when I saw the sign that said, "Continued Sessions." The discharge papers had been a lie, a carefully written lie, a story that made the world feel safe. But the truth was that the discharge was never real. The discharge was just a chapter in a book that never ended. I left the asylum that night with my mind full of questions and my heart full of dread. I drove home in silence, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The city lights felt too bright, too sharp, like they were trying to burn the memory out of me. When I got home, I locked the door and sat on the floor of my living room, staring at the wall like it was a mirror. I kept thinking about the blank paper, the pen, the way the room had felt like it had been waiting for me. I kept thinking about the photographs, the staff who never aged, the sign that said, "For patients who cannot respond." I kept thinking about the way the asylum had tried to pull me back in. And I realized something. They didn't want me to leave. Not really. They wanted me to stay. But not in the building. In the treatment. In the sessions. In the loop. I tried to sleep, but the night was full of old sounds. The sound of footsteps in a hallway, the sound of a door opening, the sound of a voice asking a question. I woke up several times, my body trembling, my mind racing. I didn't know how long I had been asleep when I heard it. A sound from the hallway. Not outside. Not from the street. From inside my apartment. A soft click. Like a door closing. My heart stopped. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound came again. Click. Click. like someone moving down the hall. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But I had to. I stood up and walked to the bedroom door. My hand was shaking as I turned the knob. The door opened. The hallway was empty. The lights were off. But the air felt cold, like the building was breathing. I stepped out into the hallway, my bare feet touching the cold floor. I walked slowly toward the living room. And then I saw it. On my coffee table, where there had been nothing before, there was a folder. My folder. The same kind of folder I had found in the asylum, with my name on it. My hands went cold. I picked it up. Inside was a copy of my discharge papers. The same words, the same signature, the same date. But something was different. At the bottom of the page, in small print, was a line I had never noticed before. Patient released to continued treatment. I stared at the words for a long time. My mind felt like it was splitting. I read the line again. Patient released to continued treatment. It didn't make sense. How could I be released to treatment? How could I be released to something that was supposed to keep me trapped? I flipped through the folder. There were more pages, more documents, more signatures, all in the same handwriting, all in the same careful style. It was like the asylum had been writing my life for years, and I hadn't even known it. I sat down on the floor, my back against the couch, and stared at the papers. I tried to remember the day I was released. I tried to remember the moment I walked out of the building and into the sunlight. But the memory was foggy. It felt like a dream, like something my mind had created to protect itself. I tried to recall the details, the faces of the staff, the sound of the doors, the feeling of the air outside. But all I could remember was the way the light had looked, like it was too bright, like it hurt. And then I remembered something else, a memory I had buried deep, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. The day they brought me to the room with the blank paper, the pen, the lamp, the chair, the way the air had felt like it was pressing on me, the way the paper had been waiting, the way the voice had seemed to come from the walls. I remembered sitting down. I remembered holding the pen. I remembered the feeling of my hand moving. But I didn't remember what I had written. I didn't remember signing anything. I didn't remember agreeing. I didn't remember giving consent. I sat there, staring at the folder, and my mind began to fill in the blanks. I began to remember things I hadn't allowed myself to remember. I remembered the sessions, not the ones I was told I had attended, the ones I wasn't supposed to remember, the ones that continued after I was released. I remembered waking up in a room that wasn't mine, a room with a chair, a lamp, a blank page. I remembered a voice asking me questions. I remembered answering, but the answers didn't feel like mine. They felt guided, like someone was speaking through me, like the asylum was using me as a patient, even when I was supposed to be free. I remembered being told I was cured. I remembered being told I was safe. I remembered being told I could go home. But I also remembered the feeling of being pulled back, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being tested. I realized then that the discharge had been part of the treatment, a step in the process, not an ending. The asylum didn't release me. It moved me. It moved the treatment into my life, into my home, into my mind. And the more I tried to fight it, the more it seemed to push back. The folder on my table wasn't just a reminder. It was a message, a reminder that the treatment was still ongoing, that the sessions had never stopped, that the discharge was never real. It was just a sentence that had been written for me, a sentence that I had been living in without knowing it. I looked around my apartment, and suddenly it felt like a room in the asylum. The walls felt too close. The air felt too still. The silence felt like a waiting room. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling. I picked up the folder and carried it to the kitchen table. I opened it again, as if the answers might be hidden deeper. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A photograph. A photo of me. But not the one I had seen in the asylum. This one was different. It was taken in my apartment. The angle was from behind me, like someone was standing in the corner watching. The photo showed me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the folder. The same folder I was holding now. My face was calm. My eyes were blank. Like I wasn't there. Like someone else was in control. I stared at the photo, unable to breathe. I flipped the photo over. There was a date written on the back. Yesterday. I hadn't taken that photo. No one had been in my apartment. No one had been watching me. And yet the photo was there. Like proof. Like evidence. Like a record. The asylum had been here. In my life. In my home. In my mind. And I had been living under their treatment without knowing it. The worst part was this. If the sessions continued after discharge, if the treatment never ended, then what was the point of being released at all? What was the point of the word cured? What was the point of anything? I sat there for a long time, staring at the photo, feeling the weight of the realization pressing down on me. And I understood something that made my stomach drop. The asylum didn't want me to be cured. It wanted me to be compliant. It wanted me to be a patient forever. It wanted to keep the treatment going, even when I wasn't inside the building. Even when I was supposed to be free. The treatment wasn't a cure. The treatment was the sentence. And I had been living it for years. When I first walked out of the asylum, I remember thinking I'd never go back. I remember the feeling of the air on my skin, like it was a reward. I remember the way the sunlight made everything look soft, like the world had been waiting for me. I remember thinking that the door behind me had closed for good. But now I know the truth. The exit was only on paper. It was a promise that sounded real. A signature that looked official. A stamp that made it feel like a final chapter. But it was just a piece of paper. A piece of paper that made me believe I was free. And I was. The more I think about it, the more I realize how the asylum trained me. Not with shocks or restraints. Not with harsh voices or loud punishments. They trained me with paperwork. With forms. With documents that made me feel safe. They trained me to trust the system. To trust the signatures. To trust the stamp. Because when you trust the system, you don't question what it does to you. You don't ask why it keeps coming back. You don't ask why the exit is only on paper. The first time I saw the folder in my apartment, I thought it was a mistake. A prank. A glitch. But after the photo, after the documents, after the feeling of being watched, I understood. The asylum didn't want me to leave. Not really. They wanted me to think I had. They wanted me to think I was free. They wanted me to go home and live my life. Because that's when the treatment becomes invisible. That's when it becomes part of you. That's when you start to believe you're normal again. And when you believe you're normal, you stop fighting. I kept thinking about the patients I had met. The ones in the therapy wing. The ones who looked like they were waiting for something. the ones who never seemed to blink, the ones who stared at the walls like they were listening. I wondered if they knew. I wondered if they knew the exit was only on paper, or if they believed the same lie I had believed. Maybe they believed it because it was easier. Maybe they believed it because the alternative was worse. Because the alternative is to know you're trapped, to know you're not free, to know that the world has been built around your mind, like a cage you can't see. I started to think about the people who had been declared cured, the ones who walked out, the ones who smiled, the ones who tried to live. I thought about the way their eyes looked when they thought no one was watching, the way they would freeze for a moment, as if listening to something no one else could hear, the way they would look at a door and hesitate, like the door might not open, the way they would touch a wall and feel the texture, as if they were checking if it was real. I realized then that the asylum didn't just keep patients inside the building. It kept them inside the idea of the asylum. It kept them inside the belief that they were still patients, even when they were not, even when they were outside, even when they were supposed to be free. And I began to see the signs in my own life. The way I would walk into a room and feel like I had been there before. The way I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was sitting beside my bed. The way I would hear a voice in my head asking questions. Not my thoughts, not my memories. Questions like a therapist speaking to a patient, like the asylum was still treating me, like the treatment never ended. The next morning, I tried to leave the apartment. I tried to go outside and feel the sunlight again, but I couldn't. I stood at the door and my hand hovered over the handle, and I felt a wave of panic. Not because I was afraid of the outside, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I went outside. Because I was afraid that the asylum would be waiting. Not in the building, but in the world. I stepped back from the door. I sat down on the floor. I put my head in my hands, and I realized something that made my chest tighten. The asylum had followed me. Not physically, but mentally. It had followed me in my thoughts, in my habits, in the way I reacted to things, in the way I believed the world was safe because of paperwork. The exit was only on paper. The treatment was the sentence, and the sentence was written into my life. I opened the folder again. I looked at the documents, the discharge papers, the signatures, the stamps, the line at the bottom. Patient released to continued treatment. I read it again. I read it like a prayer, like a confession, like a warning. And I realized something else. The discharge papers were not meant for me. They were meant for someone else. Someone who needed to believe they were free. Someone who needed to go back into the world. Someone who needed to be watched without knowing it. Someone who needed to be treated without realizing it. And I understood the worst part. I understood that the asylum wasn't just a building. It was a system that didn't end when you left, a system that followed you, a system that could reach you anywhere, even in your own home, even in your own mind, even in your own memories. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, feeling the weight of the realization pressing down on me. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote my name. I wrote the date. I wrote the words I had been told to write so many times before. I wrote them slowly, carefully, like the act of writing could protect me. I wrote, "I am free." I stared at the words. I felt a strange relief, like the words had power, like the act of writing them was a kind of escape. But then the relief faded. Because I realized the truth. The truth was that the words didn't matter. The truth was that the paper didn't matter. The truth was that the exit was only on paper. And the only real exit was the one you could never sign. The one you could never stamp. The one you could never prove. The exit that only exists in your mind. The exit that only exists if you stop believing the system. The exit that only exists if you realize the truth. The truth that some patients leave, but are never free. And I don't know which one I am. I don't know if I ever really left, or if I'm still inside the treatment, still inside the asylum, still inside the sentence. I only know this. Every time I hear a door click, every time I see a folder, every time I see a stamp, I feel the walls closing in again. And I know the exit is only on paper. The rest is just a story the asylum tells you so you can live, so you can sleep, so you can pretend you are free. But you're not. Not really. Not ever.